Welcome to Old Worlds for Sleep, where forgotten histories breathe again in the quiet hours of night. Tonight, we travel beyond the throne rooms and the marble corridors, into the hidden heart of empire, the royal nursery of 18th century England. There, a young maid named Eliza Hartwell will discover that power is not only held by kings, but whispered by those who serve them. Behind every crown, there are unseen hands that rock cradles, record secrets, and guard the fragile line between truth and silence. This is The Silent Court, a story of loyalty, quiet courage, and the invisible people who shaped history while the world slept. So settle in, let the candlelight flicker, and drift with us through the corridors of a forgotten palace, where even the smallest voice can echo through time. The first thing Eliza Hartwell noticed about Kensington Palace was the silence. Not the silence of peace, but that peculiar weighted hush that lingers in places where great things have happened, and might happen again. The carriage that brought her from Surrey had already vanished down the long gravel drive, leaving only the echo of its wheels and the faint scent of rain. Ahead loomed the red brick facade of the palace, its hundreds of windows glinting dully beneath a pale March sky. "Through this door," said the steward, his voice brisk, practiced. "Servants enter here. Always here." He led her to a narrow doorway half hidden behind a row of kitchen chimneys. Eliza ducked her head as she crossed the threshold. It was like stepping not just into a building but into another world, one ruled by order, hierarchy, and a rhythm older than herself. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soap, wax, and something metallic, perhaps the scent of 1,000 polished candlesticks. Servants moved like a river, pages carrying silver trays, scullery maids balancing buckets, grooms hurrying past with boots clutched under their arms. Each seemed to know precisely where to go and what to do, as if the palace itself conducted them in some invisible symphony. Eliza clutched her small satchel tighter. She had left behind the damp fields of her father's farm only yesterday, still half unable to believe the letter was real, a recommendation from a distant cousin who worked in the royal kitchens. A good girl, quick to learn, steady hands, the letter had said. And so here she was, a single thread about to be woven into the great tapestry of royal service. The steward handed her off to a woman of formidable bearing, Mrs. Pace, head nursemaid to the royal children. Her gown was plain but perfectly cut, her linen so white it seemed to glow. "You're the new assistant?" Mrs. Pace asked without greeting. "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said, curtsying awkwardly. "Then you'll follow instructions exactly as given. No speaking unless spoken to. The nursery is not a place for gossip or mistakes. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Pace studied her face, then gave a brief nod. "We shall see." They climbed a quiet stairway that wound upward, away from the clatter of kitchens and the laughter of stable boys. The sounds faded, replaced by the muted ticking of distant clocks. When they reached a corridor lined with pale blue doors, Mrs. Pace stopped before one marked simply nursery wing. "The children rise at 7, she said. "Breakfast at 8, lessons at 9. Baths are at 4, bedtime at 7. Their routines do not bend for anyone, least of all servants. You will assist where directed. And remember, you never touch the royal children without permission." Eliza nodded, heart pounding. The door opened onto a room bathed in morning light. Toys gleamed on polished shelves, wooden horses with silk bridles, tiny soldiers with silver swords, dolls dressed in lace finer than anything she had ever seen. At the far end, a woman sat in a high-backed chair, cradling an infant at her breast. "This is Mrs. Elliot," said Mrs. Pace, her tone softening slightly. "Wet nurse to the royal children." Mrs. Elliot looked up. Her face was calm, maternal, her eyes warm but sharp with intelligence. "So this is our new helper," she said. "Come closer, child." Eliza approached, curtsying again. The baby, a girl no more than 6 months, blinked up at her with solemn curiosity. "This is Princess Augusta," Mrs. Elliot said, smiling faintly. "And over there, that lively boy dismantling his soldiers one by one, that is Prince George." The realization struck Eliza like a physical weight. She stood in the presence of a future king. "Have you worked with infants before?" Mrs. Elliot asked. "Yes, ma'am. My mother had 8 children. I helped with the younger ones." "Good," said Mrs. Elliot. "Then you know the essentials: patience, quiet hands, and a gentle heart. Those matter more here than noble blood." She shifted the baby and held her out. "Take her." Eliza hesitated, remembering Mrs. Pace's rule, but Mrs. Elliott's expression brooked no refusal. Carefully, she took the princess, supporting her tiny head as she had done for her siblings. The infant regarded her solemnly, then reached out to grasp a loose strand of her hair. "She likes you," Mrs. Elliott murmured. "That's a good sign. Babies often see more clearly than their elders." For a moment, the weight of ceremony lifted. It was just a woman, a child, and another woman watching with cautious pride. Then the spell broke. Mrs. Pace cleared her throat, and the rhythm of duty resumed. Eliza returned the princess to her cradle. The baby sighed, drifting into sleep, her tiny fingers curling around the lace edge of her blanket. Mrs. Elliott smiled approvingly. "You'll do, I think." Outside the nursery windows, the bells of Kensington began to chime the hour. Somewhere far above, decisions of empire were being made, wars discussed, treaties drafted. Yet here, in this quiet blue room filled with soft breaths and ticking clocks, a different kind of power was being tended, the fragile heartbeat of a dynasty. Eliza looked down at the sleeping child and wondered, how many lives begin their course beneath ceilings like this, unaware of the history waiting for them? And she thought, not for the last time, that the palace might be as much a living creature as any human, filled with eyes, ears, and 1,000 silent hearts beating in time with the crown itself. By the time the palace clock struck 8, Eliza Hartwell had already learned that the royal nursery was a kingdom of its own. Unlike the echoing halls of the main apartments, where courtiers swept past in clouds of perfume and gossip, the nursery wing existed in a gentler orbit, halfway between the glitter of the throne and the dust of the servants' stairs. The corridor outside smelled faintly of milk and beeswax. The walls were painted a soft cream, hung with embroidered samplers stitched by generations of nursemaids long gone. Each bore initials faded with time, quiet memorials to women who had once rocked princes and princesses who were now names in history books. Mrs. Pace moved briskly from room to room, her keys jingling like a minor melody of authority. "This way," she instructed. "You must know every chamber by heart before noon." Eliza followed, memorizing the geography of her new world. The day nursery, where lessons and play took place, was cheerful but orderly, its windows overlooking the gardens. The night nursery lay adjacent, dimmer, with 2 gilded cradles beneath gauze canopies that shimmered faintly in the morning light. Beyond that were smaller rooms, the nursemaid's chamber, the wet nurse's quarters, and the receiving room where the royal parents were permitted brief visits. "Every space has its purpose," Mrs. Pace said, "and every purpose its rule." She paused by a small door nearly hidden behind a tapestry. "That leads to the servants' corridor, your lifeline. Never use the main passage unless summoned. The nursery must appear self-contained, quiet, immaculate. The Queen prizes serenity above all." Eliza nodded, trying to keep up with the flow of information. Rules, timings, hierarchies, all woven so tightly that even breathing seemed subject to order. When they entered the day nursery again, Mrs. Elliott was standing by the window, a ledger open before her. The morning sunlight outlined her figure in a soft aureole. "Ah, there you are," she said, looking up. "I hope Mrs. Pace has been drilling you properly. The nursery is the heart of the palace, though most courtiers forget it. What happens here echoes in rooms they'll never see." Eliza didn't yet understand what she meant, but something in Mrs. Elliott's tone made her listen closely. Prince George sat on the carpet, surrounded by his regiment of toy soldiers. His fair curls caught the light like threads of gold. Nearby, baby Augusta gurgled contentedly in her cradle, chewing on a silver rattle. It struck Eliza, almost painfully, how ordinary they looked, 2 small children playing and cooing, yet the weight of nations rested on their tiny shoulders. "Your hands are clean?" Mrs. Pace asked sharply. "Yes, ma'am." "Then help Mary with the prince's luncheon tray. The royal children dine early." The meal itself was a ceremony. Every morsel tested 3 times, every utensil polished until it gleamed. Eliza carried the tray as if it contained the crown jewels, walking carefully so the porcelain wouldn't rattle. When the prince refused his pudding, declaring in toddler defiance that he wanted only milk, Mrs. Elliott soothed him with a patience born of long practice. "He's his father's son," she said wryly. "Strong will, thin temper. But the Queen says such stubbornness will make him a fine king one day." Eliza smiled faintly, though she wasn't sure a king's temper was a blessing to anyone but himself. As the afternoon light softened, Mrs. Elliot gestured for Eliza to assist with the children's outdoor walk. The air beyond the palace smelled of damp earth and early spring. Prince George toddled between the nursemaids, clutching a wooden horse, while Augusta rode in a cushioned pram. The royal garden stretched endlessly ahead, perfectly trimmed hedges, statues of gods frozen in eternal grace, fountains catching the pale sun. "See there," Mrs. Elliot said quietly, nodding toward a distant window. "That's where His Majesty keeps his private study. He often looks out toward the gardens, though never at us. Still, be mindful. The king notices more than he admits." They walked in silence a while, the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes the only sound. A group of courtiers passed along the far path, their laughter sharp as glass. None glanced toward the nursemaids. In that moment, Eliza understood her invisibility and the strange freedom it carried. "Remember," Mrs. Elliot said as they returned indoors, "ours is the gentlest service, but it is also the most observed. Every whisper here can travel to the throne by breakfast, and every careless gesture may reach the queen before supper." That evening, after the children were bathed and asleep, Eliza found herself alone for the first time in her narrow chamber beside the night nursery. The candlelight flickered across the small window, revealing the faint silhouette of the palace gardens beyond. She thought of her father's words before she left home: "Keep your head down, girl. Palace folk eat secrets for supper." Now she knew how right he had been. Outside, a nightingale began to sing in the dark. Its song rose pure and lonely through the corridors of stone. Somewhere, far above, the king might be dictating letters of war or peace. But here, in this quiet wing, another kind of history unfolded, tender, repetitive, unseen. Eliza lay down, exhausted but awake, wondering how many servants before her had looked at these same walls and thought, "I will learn the rhythm of this place before it swallows me." The clock struck 9. The sound rolled through the corridors like a heartbeat, steady, eternal. And slowly, lulled by it, she drifted into sleep, the faint scent of milk and candle wax lingering like a benediction. The first time Eliza saw Queen Caroline, she nearly forgot to breathe. It was a quiet Thursday morning, soft rain tracing silver lines down the nursery windows. The children had just finished their porridge, and Mrs. Elliot was arranging Prince George's curls while humming a tune half lullaby, half prayer. Then came the knock, a measured, elegant rhythm that could belong to no one else. Mrs. Pace straightened immediately. "Her Majesty." Every servant in the nursery froze in place. Eliza felt her pulse quicken as the door opened. The queen entered not like a monarch descending upon her subjects, but like someone walking through a memory. She was tall, composed, her face both kind and weary, as though centuries of duty had pressed their seal upon her brow. Her gown, a muted blue silk, shimmered faintly with every movement, and she carried the faint scent of lavender and old books. "Good morning, Mrs. Elliot," she said warmly. "How are my little darlings today?" Mrs. Elliot rose and curtsied deeply, her voice calm. "Both children are thriving, Your Majesty. The prince knows 3 new words this week, and the princess sleeps through the night." "Excellent." The queen moved closer to the cradle where Princess Augusta lay, blinking up at her royal mother. For a long moment, the queen simply looked, then reached out, hesitated, and gently touched the baby's cheek. It was a fleeting gesture, but to Eliza it seemed to hold the weight of something unsaid. "She favors her father's side," the queen murmured. "But the eyes, those are mine." Eliza watched from her place by the wall, afraid even to breathe too loudly. In her imagination, queens had always been distant figures, painted on coins or spoken of in church prayers. Yet here was a real woman bending over her child, her hand trembling just slightly. "And the prince?" the queen asked, turning toward the lively toddler. Prince George stood on a stool, waving his wooden horse like a sword. "Mama," he declared proudly. "Look, gallop." The queen smiled, a brief, radiant expression that transformed her face. "Very fine, my son. A brave rider already." Then just as swiftly the smile faded. She straightened, smoothing her gown. "I must not keep you from your work, Mrs. Elliot. You know their needs better than anyone." "Your Majesty's trust honors me," Mrs. Elliot replied. The queen glanced toward Eliza. "And this is the new helper Mehmet mentioned?" Eliza dropped into her deepest curtsy. "Yes, Your Majesty." Queen Caroline studied her for a heartbeat, then gave a small nod. "A steady gaze," she said. That is rare among the young. See that you keep it. The palace has a way of testing the soul. And just like that, she was gone, the faint rustle of silk the only sign she had ever been there. When the door closed, Eliza exhaled for the first time. Was I trembling? She whispered to Mary. Only a little, Mary whispered back. Everyone does the first time. You did well. Mrs. Elliott's tone was brisk but approving. Her Majesty values composure. Remember that. The Queen observes more than she shows. For the rest of the morning, Eliza moved as if in a dream. The Queen's words echoed in her mind. The palace has a way of testing the soul. What did that mean exactly? Was it warning or wisdom? Later, as she polished the silver feeding cups, she caught Mrs. Elliot watching her thoughtfully. You handled yourself well, Mrs. Elliot said. Not all servants can meet the Queen's gaze without shrinking. I was only afraid of making a mistake, Eliza admitted. Fear keeps the hand steady, Mrs. Elliot said, but never let it rule your heart. This place rewards those who see clearly. Eliza hesitated. Mrs. Elliot, may I ask something? Of course. When the Queen visits, she seems kind yet distant. Does she not wish to stay longer with her children? Mrs. Elliot's expression softened. It's not a lack of love. The King and Queen live beneath a crown that weighs heavier than it looks. Affection in their world must pass through ceremony first. It is the way of monarchy. Eliza nodded, though she didn't fully understand. That evening, after the children were asleep, she lingered by the window of the night nursery. Rain had stopped. The garden lamps flickered like fireflies across the dark lawns. Somewhere beyond those windows, the Queen would be in her library, reading or writing letters to distant kings. Eliza thought of her words again. The palace tests the soul, and wondered what kind of tests awaited her. Are you still awake? Mary whispered from the next room. Yes. Thinking about the Queen? Eliza smiled faintly. How did you know? Because we all do. The first time she looks at you, you start to see the palace differently. Like the walls have ears and a heart. Eliza looked back toward the sleeping children, their faces peaceful beneath embroidered quilts. Do you think they dream? She asked softly. Mary yawned. Of what, I wonder? Crowns or clouds? Eliza's voice dropped to a murmur. Maybe both. And as the palace bells chimed midnight, she found herself asking, how much of what we see here is truth and how much is performance? The question lingered like candle smoke as she drifted to sleep, the nursery once again sinking into the quiet rhythm of breathing, ticking, and dreams. By her third week in the royal nursery, Eliza Hartwell had begun to move like part of the machinery itself. The rhythm of palace life was exacting but predictable. Dawn bells, nursery breakfast, lessons, promenade, supper, prayers, silence. Even her footsteps had learned the measured cadence of a servant who neither hurries nor dawdles. But beneath that calm surface, she had begun to sense something else. A second rhythm, quieter and stranger. A glance exchanged between Mrs. Elliot and the Turkish valet Mehmet. A question Mrs. Pace asked twice, though she already knew the answer. The way conversation stopped when certain footsteps passed outside the door. Eliza told herself she imagined it. Yet the palace itself seemed to hum with secrets, as if the very walls remembered what people dared not speak. It was during one gray afternoon, while the children napped, that Mrs. Elliot sent for her. Tea, Miss Hartwell, the wet nurse said, her voice calm but deliberate. And bring your questions with you. The invitation startled Eliza. A private tea with the head of the nursery was not ordinary courtesy. It was a signal. Mrs. Elliot's chamber lay just beyond the night nursery. The room was warm, faintly perfumed with lavender and wool. A teapot rested on the table beside 2 cups of porcelain so fine Eliza could almost see through them. Sit, Mrs. Elliot said, pouring the tea. You've done well so far. Calm hands, careful speech. But there's more to serving this family than feeding and folding. You've begun to notice it, haven't you? Eliza hesitated. Sometimes, it feels as though there are 2 palaces. The one everyone sees and the one beneath it. Mrs. Elliot smiled, not unkindly. Then your eyes are opening. Most never see it at all. Outside, rain tapped against the windows like soft fingers. This palace, Mrs. Elliot continued, is not merely walls and servants. It is an organism, alive, listening, breathing. Information flows through it like blood. Those who understand that flow hold a kind of power no title can match. Eliza frowned slightly. power? For servants? For anyone who can observe and remember, Mrs. Elliot replied. We know who visits, who whispers, who stays too long. It may seem trivial, but such details shape the fates of ministers and kings. The Queen herself once confided that her wet nurse learned more truth in a week than her advisors in a year. Eliza wasn't sure whether to be impressed or uneasy. You think of gossip, Mrs. Elliot said, reading her face. But gossip is aimless. Observation has purpose. Those who see clearly can protect others and themselves. She sipped her tea, eyes half-lidded. Mehmet and I began such a network years ago. We were both outsiders, you see. He, a Turkish prisoner turned valet. I, a common woman raised to the Queen's confidence through care of royal infants. Alone we were vulnerable. Together we became indispensable. Eliza's heart beat faster. A network of servants? Mrs. Elliot nodded. Of eyes and ears quietly placed throughout the palace. We share what we learn, never to harm the royal family but to anticipate storms before they break. Neutrality, Miss Hartwell, is a luxury few can afford in a place like this. Either you join the circle that protects, or you stand alone when the wind shifts. Eliza's hands tightened around her teacup. She thought of the whispered warnings she'd heard below stairs. Keep your head down, the palace eats the careless. Would I be expected to spy? She asked quietly. Mrs. Elliot's voice softened. To observe. Nothing more. You already do it without trying. Every time you notice who visits, who lingers by the cradle, who praises the children a little too loudly. You're learning the palace language. I'm simply offering you a place among those who speak it. A faint knock interrupted them. Mary appeared at the door, curtsying. Forgive me, Mrs. Elliot. The prince is stirring. Mrs. Elliot waved her off with a nod. We're finished. When Mary left, the wet nurse leaned forward. Think on what I've said, child. This palace rewards those who see beyond its gilded surface, but it devours those who pretend not to see. Eliza rose, curtsied, and returned to the nursery. The children were awake, their laughter echoing softly between the blue-painted walls. Yet even that innocent sound seemed changed to her now, like music played above an unseen drumbeat. As she folded the prince's linen napkins later that night, Mary nudged her gently. Tea with Mrs. Elliot, was it? Eliza nodded. She spoke of eyes and ears. Mary smiled knowingly. Then you've been noticed. Be careful what you choose, Eliza. Once you step into that circle, you never quite step out. When the palace bells tolled midnight, Eliza lay in her small chamber, staring at the faint outline of the window. Rain whispered against the glass. Somewhere above, decisions of empire turned like hidden gears. She whispered to herself, a palace of eyes and ears. And for the first time she wondered, not just what she served, but who truly ruled this great, silent kingdom, the crowned or those who watched them from the shadows. Late that March afternoon, when the sky hung low and the palace corridors glowed amber with candlelight, the royal nursery received a most unusual visitor. Mrs. Pace had announced it in her brisk, precise tone. A delegation from the Americas, sent by the Cherokee chief Tomochichi. One of their number will present gifts to the royal children before his return home. To Eliza, the words sounded almost unreal. She had heard of the Cherokee, people of forests and rivers, described in the pamphlets the kitchen clerks sometimes passed around, but she had never imagined one would walk through the same corridors she now cleaned and crossed daily. When the door opened, silence fell. The young man who entered was not dressed like anyone Eliza had seen before. He wore leggings of soft buckskin, a coat of fine English tailoring, and moccasins fastened with silver buckles that gleamed as he stepped onto the nursery carpet. His bearing was quiet but assured. His dark eyes held the calm of someone who had looked upon great distances. Mrs. Pace greeted him with formality. "You're welcome, sir. The royal children will receive your gifts presently." The visitor bowed slightly. "I bring greetings from Chief Tomochichi," he said in careful English. "He wishes health to the king's grandchildren and friendship between our nations." From a small leather pouch he withdrew two objects. The first, a tiny bow and arrow set, carved from polished wood, its string of sinew fine as thread. The second, a doll dressed in creek-patterned cloth, her tiny face painted with gentleness. "For the prince and princess," he said. Mrs. Pace examined them discreetly. Protocol demanded caution, but her eyes softened. "They are beautiful. The children will treasure them." When Prince George was brought in, he immediately reached for the bow, laughter bubbling from him as the visitor knelt and showed him how to hold it. In our tradition, the man explained, a boy receives his first bow at the age of 3, to learn patience and skill early. Eliza watched, entranced. There was no stiffness in his manner, none of the forced cheer that so many courtiers affected. He spoke to the child as to a small equal, guiding his hand gently, letting him fumble and learn. Meanwhile, Princess Augusta, freshly awakened from her nap, gazed solemnly from Mrs. Elliot's arms. "Would you like to hold her?" Mrs. Elliot asked suddenly. Eliza blinked at the breach of protocol. Mrs. Pace hesitated, then after a long moment nodded. The visitor stepped forward carefully, taking the baby with a reverence that seemed instinctive. His large hands supported her head perfectly. Augusta, after a brief inspection, reached for his braid and laughed. "She has strong eyes," he said softly. "Among my people, we would say she has an old soul." Mrs. Elliot smiled. "You seem comfortable with children." "I have 3 younger sisters," he replied. "In our villages, all adults share in caring for children. They belong to everyone, not only their parents." The words, spoken simply, hung in the air like incense. Mrs. Pace looked at him curiously, then nodded. "Different lands, different customs. Though perhaps ours could learn from yours." Eliza felt something shift inside her. She had spent weeks watching how the palace separated love from duty, affection from rank. Yet here was a man from across the sea, teaching a royal household that care needed no titles. When the children's play ended, the visitor prepared to take his leave. At the door, he turned to Mrs. Elliot. "Chief Tomochichi asked me to tell you this. The measure of a great nation is not its gold or its palaces, but how it cares for its children." He said he was glad to see that truth alive here. Mrs. Elliot's composure wavered for a heartbeat. She inclined her head. "Please convey our gratitude to your chief. His words will be remembered." When he was gone, a hush lingered, one of those silences that follow after something meaningful has passed. The nursery seemed changed, gentler somehow. Even the ticking of the clock felt slower. As Eliza folded linens beside Mary, she said quietly, "It's strange." He spoke of caring for children as though it were a duty shared by all, not just the privileged. Mary smiled. Maybe that's why his people call him wise. Here everyone guards their place. Down there, perhaps hearts are freer. Eliza nodded, thinking of the Queen's brief visits, of the countless invisible walls that divided affection from propriety. "Do you think love is smaller in palaces?" she asked softly. Mary shrugged. "Maybe not smaller, just dressed in too much silk." That night, after the candles were snuffed, Eliza lingered by the window of her chamber. A thin moon hung above the palace roofs, pale as milk. Somewhere, across an ocean she had never seen, a great forest waited, a world of river mist and starlit silence, where mothers and strangers alike could hold a child without needing permission. For a long moment, she imagined that world, and wondered if compassion could travel as easily as ships. Then, closing her eyes, she whispered a question to the dark. If the greatness of a nation lies in how it loves its children, what, then, makes a heart great? The question went unanswered, but the night seemed to listen. The evening began in perfect order. The children had been fed, their toys returned to their shelves, the nursery swept and quiet. Outside, a light snow had started to fall, softening the sounds of the palace. The fireplaces glowed low, their warmth steady against the February chill. Eliza was folding napkins for the morning when Mrs. Elliot entered, her face unusually tense. "Something's wrong with the princess," she said softly. Eliza followed her at once to the night nursery. Princess Augusta lay in her cradle, cheeks flushed deep crimson, her small hands twitching restlessly in the lace folds of her blanket. The faint heat of fever radiated from her tiny body. "She was fine an hour ago," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "Now she burns." Mrs. Elliot's calm never quite broke, but her movements quickened. "Cool compresses. And fetch Dr. Arbuthnot immediately." Eliza hurried to obey. She ran down the quiet servants' corridor, candles shaking in her hand. The palace at night was a maze of shadows, portraits watching her from the walls, the floorboards sighing beneath her steps. When she found the footman outside the doctor's quarters, her breath came in white clouds. "Princess Augusta, fever?" she said. The words alone were enough. Within minutes, Dr. Arbuthnot was pulling on his coat, medical bag in hand, his face grave but composed. Back in the nursery, Mrs. Elliot and Mary were working silently. Towels soaked in cool water lay folded on a silver tray. The scent of lavender mixed with vinegar filled the air. Eliza pressed the damp cloth gently against the princess's forehead, feeling the heat pulse through the linen. Dr. Arbuthnot arrived shortly after, his hair disheveled from sleep. He examined the infant with practiced gentleness, checking her pulse, her breath, her tiny tongue. "Teething fever," he murmured after a moment. "Nothing alarming yet, but we'll not take chances." He reached into his bag and produced a small glass vial. A tincture of willow bark. 3 drops every 4 hours. Mrs. Elliot's eyes flicked toward him. Could it be smallpox, doctor? Uncertainty flickered in his expression, but only briefly. Unlikely. Her Majesty was wise to have the children inoculated. Still, keep the prince apart until we're sure. And so began the longest night of Eliza's life. They worked in near silence, guided by the rhythm of breathing and the slow ticking of the nursery clock. The fever rose and fell like the tide. At times, the princess whimpered softly, and Eliza felt helpless before the frailty of such a tiny body. "Shoo," Mrs. Elliot whispered, dipping another cloth. "Stay with me, child. Breathe steady." At 3 in the morning, the fever spiked sharply. Augusta's skin glistened with sweat. Her breathing grew shallow. Panic clawed at Eliza's throat. "She's worsening." Mrs. Elliot pressed her fingers to the child's chest, then turned to Mary. "Fetch the doctor again, run." While Mary vanished down the corridor, Eliza and Mrs. Elliot remained by the cradle. The candlelight trembled across Mrs. Elliot's face, revealing a strain Eliza had never seen before. "Don't falter," she said quietly. "The children draw strength from those who care for them. Even now she listens." Eliza swallowed hard. "Should we wake the Queen?" Mrs. Elliot shook her head. "Not until the doctor confirms it. Royal sleep is not disturbed lightly." The words stung. Eliza could not fathom any mother choosing rest over fear. Yet she obeyed. In the nursery, protocol was as sacred as prayer. Dr. Arbuthnot returned within minutes, his coat thrown hastily over his nightclothes. His face softened when he saw the baby still breathing, though weakly. "She'll live through it," he murmured. "The worst will pass before dawn." He prepared a mixture of honey and lavender, adding a single drop of laudanum. "This will ease her pain and bring sleep." Hours crept by. The first pale light of morning seeped through the curtains just as the fever broke. Augusta's breathing deepened, the heat faded from her skin. Her small hands relaxed and she sighed, a sound so ordinary it brought tears to Mrs. Elliot's eyes. "Thank God," she whispered, lowering her head. Eliza exhaled for the first time in hours. Her hands trembled, the exhaustion washing through her bones. Dr. Arbuthnot smiled faintly. "She's strong. You all did well." When he left, the 3 women sat together in silence, watching the princess sleep. Beyond the nursery, the palace began to stir. Footsteps of servants, bells for breakfast, life returning to its ordinary rhythm. But inside the nursery, nothing felt ordinary. Mrs. Elliot looked toward Eliza. "Do you understand now why we guard them so fiercely?" Eliza nodded. "It isn't just duty. It's love disguised as order." "Exactly," Mrs. Elliot said softly. "We are the hands that hold the future, though no one will remember our names." Eliza turned toward the cradle. The princess slept peacefully, unaware of the night that might have stolen her breath. Outside, the snow still fell, quiet and pure, blanketing the palace roofs in white. As Eliza finally sat down, fatigue pressing on her shoulders, she thought of Mrs. Elliot's words from their secret tea. Neutrality is rarely an option. In that moment she understood them anew. This palace of glitter and ceremony was also a web of unseen loyalties, threads of care, duty, and quiet defiance, all intertwined around the fragile heartbeat of a child. And as dawn broke over Kensington, Eliza whispered to herself, "Perhaps we are all watchers, each in our own way, guarding what others cannot see." By the time the palace bells marked Sunday morning, the fever had already faded into memory. Princess Augusta woke with her usual appetite, her cheeks no longer flushed but rosy with health. Prince George clapped his hands when he saw her sitting up, declaring in his small proud voice, "Gus, wake." The nursery exhaled as one. Dr. Arbuthnot, who had remained through the dawn hours, gave his final instructions before departing. Keep her warm, let her rest, and above all, do not let rumor outrun the truth. The palace has long corridors and whispers travel faster than doctors. Mrs. Elliot inclined her head. We'll see to that, Doctor. But by midday the whispers had already begun. A fever in the nursery, someone had heard. A royal illness, said another. By tea time, one kitchen maid swore she'd seen the Queen herself pacing the corridors. So when the royal visit was announced that afternoon, none were surprised. Mrs. Elliot set to work with the precision of a general before inspection. The Queen must see nothing but health and harmony, she ordered. Every ribbon straight, every spoon polished. Eliza, see to the doll from the Cherokee visitor. Place it where Her Majesty will notice. The nursery transformed within the hour. The scent of beeswax filled the air. Light from the tall windows fell like gold upon the children's toys. Augusta wore a gown of soft white muslin trimmed with blue silk. Prince George, restless with excitement, practiced his letters beside Mary. Then came the sound that sent a shiver through every servant. The measured knock, followed by the crisp announcement, Her Majesty Queen Caroline. All curtsied as the door opened. The Queen entered with her usual composure, though today her face bore the faintest shadow of worry. She crossed the room swiftly, her skirts whispering across the polished floor. My dear Mrs. Elliot, she said, I hear our little Augusta has been unwell. Mrs. Elliot curtsied. A mild teething fever, Your Majesty. The doctor attended through the night. She has recovered completely. The Queen's gaze fell upon the baby in her cradle. For a long moment she said nothing, then reached out, brushing a strand of the infant's hair from her forehead. She looks well indeed, the Queen murmured, her voice softer than usual. It is strange how quickly they mend while we... She stopped herself, straightened, and added briskly, Dr. Arbuthnot is to be commended. Of course, Your Majesty, Mrs. Elliot said. The Queen turned to the prince, who stood proudly by his wooden alphabet board. And what have we learned this week, my clever boy? The toddler beamed. AMK, he shouted triumphantly, quite out of order. Queen Caroline laughed, a brief, clear sound that broke the tension. Marvelous. Such energy deserves a reward. She drew 2 small silver trinkets from her sleeve, handing one to each child. Eliza, standing quietly near the wall, could not help noticing how every detail had been orchestrated to reassure. The Queen's expression softened exactly when needed. Mrs. Elliot guided the conversation without seeming to do so. Even the toys had been placed with purpose. This was not mere affection. It was presentation, a performance of stability for anyone who might carry tales to the court. When the Queen rose to depart, she paused. Her eyes moved from Mrs. Elliot to Eliza. You handled matters well, she said. Children fall ill, it cannot be helped. What matters is calm management. Her gaze lingered on Eliza. You were present, I believe? Yes, Your Majesty, Eliza answered quietly. Then remember this, the Queen said. A royal household survives not through grandeur, but through discretion. What is done here echoes farther than you imagine. Eliza curtsied deeply. I understand, ma'am. After the Queen left, the nursery seemed to exhale again. Mary whispered, She's kinder than I expected. Mrs. Elliot replied without looking up. Kindness and command are not opposites. She understands both. Later that evening, Mehmed appeared briefly at the door, his expression unreadable. His Majesty inquires after the princess's health, he said in his formal tone. Tell him she thrives, Mrs. Elliot replied just as formally. But when his eyes met Eliza's, he gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement. The network had noticed her calm through the crisis. As dusk deepened, Eliza helped settle the children for the night. The palace outside was quiet again, the crisis buried under polished etiquette and scented candles. Yet she could not stop thinking of the Queen's words. Discretion keeps a royal household alive. Did it also keep it honest? She wondered. She looked at Augusta, sleeping peacefully, her tiny hand resting on the Cherokee doll's embroidered skirt. Then at George, sprawled in his bed, one silver trinket clutched tight. They were symbols as much as children, living proof of the dynasty's strength. And she, a servant, had helped protect that illusion. As she doused the last candle, she asked the darkness quietly, Is this what loyalty means? To tell the truth softly enough that it sounds like reassurance? No one answered, but the palace seemed to listen all the same. The invitation came quietly, folded within routine. Eliza was finishing the evening inventory of linen when Mrs. Elliot entered the nursery with her usual composed grace. "You've worked hard since the fever," she said. "Mrs. Pace and I are grateful. Tonight, however, I'd like you to accompany me elsewhere." "Elsewhere, ma'am?" "To supper," Mrs. Elliot replied simply. "A small gathering of trusted servants. You've earned a place among them." The words made Eliza's pulse quicken. She remembered the tea, the talk of unseen networks, of those who observe and remember. Was this her summons into that hidden circle? When the children were asleep and Mary settled into her night watch, Mrs. Elliot led the way down the silent servants' corridor. The lamps flickered low, casting long shadows along the stone. They passed the laundry vaults and the pantry stairs, finally arriving at a narrow door near the king's private apartments. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of roasted meat and wine. The chamber was nothing like a servant's hall. It was comfortably furnished, with bookshelves, a small fire, and a table laid for supper. Mehmet rose as they entered. He wore no livery tonight, only a dark coat that gave him an almost scholarly air. "Welcome, Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice low but courteous. "You've been spoken of with respect." Around the table sat several others. A broad-shouldered man with groomsman's hands, a woman in a fine maid's gown with clever eyes, a thin butler polishing his spectacles, and a German lady secretary who nodded politely as Eliza took her seat. "This," Mrs. Elliot said, "is the inner circle. Each of us serves in a different corner of the palace, yet we are united by purpose." Mehmet poured wine for each. "We are the eyes and ears of order," he said. "Not spies, not plotters. We observe. We protect." The groom, James Wilson as he introduced himself, leaned forward. "And sometimes, we prevent foolishness before it reaches the throne." Laughter rippled softly around the table, not mocking but knowing. Eliza sat very still, trying to read the atmosphere. It wasn't sinister. If anything, it felt oddly domestic. Friends at a supper table, speaking openly for the first time after long days of careful silence. Thomas Hawkins, the under-butler, spoke next. The Spanish ambassador argued with Lord Harrington again. The Queen smiled through dinner, but the footmen heard enough to know another treaty's faltering. The German secretary, Elizabeth Schultz, nodded thoughtfully. Her Majesty dictated 2 letters to Madrid this week. They carried a tone of disappointment. I can confirm the tension. And yet, Mehmet added quietly, His Majesty plans a hunting trip as if to prove serenity. Poor timing, politically speaking. Eliza listened, astonished. These were servants, yet they spoke of matters she had only read in broadsheets: wars, treaties, empire. Sarah Mitchell, the Duchess of Marlborough's maid, turned to her. "And what of the nursery, Miss Hartwell? Any unusual callers of late?" Caught off guard, Eliza hesitated. "The French ambassador's wife visited 2 days ago," she said slowly. "She asked many questions about the children's routines. When they play, who tends them, who has access." The table grew very still. Mehmet's gaze sharpened. Did she indeed? Curious, when her husband's attention is supposedly fixed upon the colonies. James the groom grunted. "Sounds like she's mapping vulnerabilities." Mrs. Elliot's tone remained calm, but her eyes glinted. "Then we'll make note. For now, the nursery schedule will not be shared with foreign guests." Eliza sat back, realizing what she'd just done, contributed to the machinery of palace intelligence. The conversation continued, details traded, patterns noted, small adjustments proposed. There was no treason here, no malice, only vigilance. They spoke as craftsmen of information, shaping the unseen threads that bound the court together. When the meal ended, Mehmet looked directly at her. "You've been quiet, Miss Hartwell. Tell us your impression." She took a breath. "I think this is wisdom disguised as service. Everyone here serves loyally, but also refuses blindness." A smile touched his lips. "Precisely. We do not rebel against power, we steady it." As they rose to leave, Mrs. Elliot placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. "You understand now why we trust few. The king may sit on the throne, but it is the quiet watchers who keep it upright." They returned through the sleeping corridors. The palace was still, the hush deep enough to hear the wind brushing the windows. When Eliza reached the nursery, she paused at the door. The children slept peacefully, unaware of the invisible lattice of care and caution that surrounded them. She touched the cradle's edge lightly, her heart full and uncertain. Had she stepped into wisdom, or into something far more complicated? In the faint light of the embers, she whispered, "Power has many faces. Some smile, some listen." And though the palace gave no answer, she sensed it understood. In the weeks that followed the supper in Mehmet's chambers, Eliza began to see the palace differently. What once seemed a series of grand rooms and glittering ceremonies now appeared as a web, each thread vibrating faintly with whispers, movements, and unseen exchanges. She no longer passed through corridors as a mere servant, but as a listener in a house that breathed secrets. Mrs. Elliot's lessons continued, though never openly. Her instructions came disguised as ordinary remarks. "Watch who lingers too long by the nursery door," she'd say while folding linen. "Notice whose questions return in new forms," she'd add while stirring the prince's porridge. To the casual ear they were nothing, but to Eliza they were keys to a hidden language. At first, the patterns she observed seemed harmless. Lady Carleton visited the nursery more often, praising Prince George's every syllable. Her laughter was bright, but her eyes were calculating. "She's the ambassador's wife," Mary whispered one morning. "Her husband wants Venice. The Queen favors someone else. She's here to charm her way into influence." Eliza recorded such details silently as Mrs. Elliot had taught. When the older woman asked during their evening tea, Eliza reported them carefully, not as gossip, but as small facts awaiting interpretation. Mrs. Elliot listened, then smiled. "You see, my dear, affection is a form of diplomacy. A word to a child may weigh as much as a treaty signed in the king's chamber." One afternoon, while helping hang the children's winter coats near the south corridor, Eliza overheard two footmen talking in low voices. "Did you hear? The Spanish negotiations are failing again. They say Lord Harrington blames the Queen's circle. She'll not forgive him if he spreads it," the other replied. "Mark me, there'll be changes before spring." They fell silent when they saw her, but the words had already lodged themselves in her mind. That evening, she repeated them quietly to Mrs. Elliot. The wet nurse nodded. "Then it begins." Eliza frowned. "What begins?" "The shifting of alliances. You'll learn to feel it before you hear it. The court changes color like the sea, subtle, constant. You must learn to read the tides." That night, Eliza dreamt of the palace as a vast ocean, its corridors as currents, its servants as small fish darting through eddies of rumor and command. And somewhere high above, the king drifted like a distant ship, carried by winds he no longer controlled. A few days later, as Eliza carried linens to the laundry stair, she passed a cluster of courtiers descending from the queen's apartments. Their conversation stopped as she approached, but one phrase caught her ear. "The Turkish valet again. Too close to Her Majesty's council, some say." The words pricked her heart like a pin. "Mehmet." She mentioned it to Mrs. Elliot that evening. The wet nurse's expression didn't change, but her hand paused over the teacup. "Then we must be careful," she said. "The higher a servant rises, the more dangerous his footing." Eliza hesitated. "Do you trust him, ma'am?" "With my life," Mrs. Elliot replied quietly. "But trust is not the same as safety." From that day, Eliza noticed how often Mehmet's shadow crossed the nursery door. He came under the guise of delivering messages from the king, requests for reports on the children's health or gifts to be passed along, but always stayed a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes he asked simple questions. "How often does the Queen visit? Do the foreign guests seem curious about the nursery?" His tone was polite, his smile faint, but behind both lived a sharpness Eliza could feel. One morning, while airing linens near the east window, she caught sight of him below in the courtyard, speaking to a messenger from the treasury. Their conversation was brief, but the messenger's nervous posture spoke volumes. Eliza began to understand what Mrs. Elliot meant when she said the palace is alive. Every gesture, every silence, every pause carried meaning. She found herself whispering questions to herself while she worked, as though testing her new skill. Why did Lady Carleton suddenly send gifts to the nursery after her husband's public disagreement with the Queen's minister? Why did Dr. Arbuthnot request more frequent reports now, after weeks of calm? And why did Mehmet seem preoccupied, his usual composure replaced by quiet vigilance? Each question was a thread, and Eliza began weaving them into a tapestry of meaning that no single person could see alone. One evening, Mrs. Elliot asked, "What have you observed today that others have missed?" Eliza thought carefully. "I think the palace listens to itself," she said at last. "Even the walls seem to echo differently when tension rises, like breath before a storm." Mrs. Elliot smiled, the faintest glimmer of pride in her eyes. "Then you are learning to hear, not just to see. That's the beginning of true awareness." Later, as she sat alone by her small window, she could hear faint voices from the grand apartments far above. Laughter, music, the clinking of glass, the public face of the court. But underneath it all, another sound pulsed faintly through the stone, the soft murmur of whispers, the heartbeat of a living palace that kept its secrets close. She asked the night, softly, "If knowledge is power, what is silence?" Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters, as if the palace itself chose not to answer. The winter finally began to loosen its grip on Kensington. Each morning, pale sunlight slipped through the nursery windows a little earlier, and the scent of thawing earth drifted faintly from the gardens below. It was Dr. Arbuthnot who first suggested that the royal children should spend more time outdoors. "Fresh air," he declared, "is a better tonic than any tincture. Bundle them well and let them breathe God's wind." Mrs. Elliot approved. "The Queen trusts his judgment. We'll begin at once." That afternoon, Eliza found herself carrying Princess Augusta, wrapped in a fur-lined shawl, while Mary held the prince's hand as he toddled excitedly toward the garden path. The private gardens of the palace were not like the public grounds the townsfolk glimpsed from the gates. Here, high brick walls shielded the royal family from curious eyes. Stone urns stood like sentinels along the walkways, and neatly clipped hedges framed patches of early snowdrops just daring to bloom. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet grass and smoke. Prince George squealed with delight as he chased a pigeon across the gravel. "Faster! Faster!" he shouted, tripping and laughing in the same breath. "Careful, Your Highness," Mary called gently. "That pond is still half frozen." Mrs. Elliot smiled indulgently but kept her gaze moving. She missed nothing: the gardener's distant bow, the slight pause of a footman near the gate, the faint reflection in the palace windows where watchers sometimes stood unseen. Eliza noticed it too, the presence of eyes everywhere. Even here, amid birdsong and children's laughter, the palace watched itself. They stopped near a low bench where the sunlight broke through a cluster of bare branches. Mrs. Elliot directed Eliza to set the princess's cradle there. "Doctor's orders," she said softly. "The sun will do her good." Eliza adjusted the blankets carefully. The baby blinked at the light, her small hand reaching upward as if to touch the golden air. "How still it is," Eliza murmured. "As though the world beyond these walls doesn't exist." Mrs. Elliot gave a small, knowing smile. "It exists, my dear. It just waits for the right door to open." At that moment, Eliza glanced upward and saw a figure watching from one of the upper windows, the unmistakable silhouette of Mehmet. He stood motionless for a moment, then turned away. "He checks on us often," Mrs. Elliot said quietly, following her gaze. "The king seldom asks directly about his grandchildren, but Mehmet keeps him informed." Eliza hesitated. "Does the king not care for them?" Mrs. Elliot folded her hands. "Royal affection is complicated. The king and his son rarely see eye to eye. Too much interest in the grandchildren could be seen as interference. Here, even love must pass through protocol." The explanation left Eliza silent. She looked at the children, one laughing, one sleeping, and wondered how many affections had been trimmed and trained in this palace, like the hedges of its gardens. As they walked along the paths, Eliza began to notice small details she'd missed before. A gardener who bowed twice instead of once. A chamberlain strolling too near the walls, pretending to study the flower beds. A folded letter that slipped from the sleeve of a messenger and was swiftly retrieved. Every motion seemed purposeful, every gesture layered with intent. She thought of Mrs. Elliot's lessons. The palace is alive. Watch its breathing. When they returned to the nursery, the air indoors felt heavier after the open sky. The children soon slept, their cheeks pink from the cold. Later that afternoon, Mehmet appeared in the doorway. "His Majesty sends thanks," he said formally. "The Queen is pleased with the doctor's regimen." Eliza curtsied, but his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a moment. "You noticed the watchers in the garden?" he asked quietly when Mrs. Elliot stepped aside to speak with Mary. "I did, sir." He nodded. "Good. Most walk blind through this palace. You, at least, are learning to see." He said no more and left as silently as he had come. That night, Eliza could not sleep. The image of the garden lingered in her mind, the baby's hand reaching for sunlight, the boy's laughter echoing off stone, the shadow in the upper window. It struck her how the nursery, the gardens, even the air itself were part of the same careful design, a stage where innocence and vigilance danced side by side. She wondered whether the queen ever walked those paths alone, or if every royal footstep was measured by unseen guards. Before extinguishing her candle, she whispered softly to the sleeping air. "Who protects whom in this place, the children or the secrets around them?" No one answered. But from beyond the window, the faint rustle of the garden leaves seemed to sigh, as if agreeing that even sunlight within a palace carried shadows. A week after the garden excursions began, the king's messenger arrived at the nursery. He came without fanfare, no royal announcement, no trumpet from the courtyard, only the sound of quick, measured steps and the scent of winter air clinging to his cloak. Eliza looked up from polishing the silver feeding cup and felt at once that something unusual was about to happen. Mehmet entered behind the messenger, his face calm but intent. He bowed briefly to Mrs. Elliot before speaking. "His Majesty sends greetings and requests an update on the children's health. He also asks that a small gift be prepared for delivery to the Queen's apartments." Mrs. Elliot inclined her head, her tone perfectly steady. "The prince and princess thrive as always. The fever left no trace. And the gift?" "A handkerchief," Mehmet replied, "embroidered with the princess's initials. The Queen appreciates tokens that carry meaning." Eliza knew enough now to recognize the layers beneath such simple words. A gift in the royal household was rarely just a gesture of affection. It was message, reassurance, and maneuver all at once. While Mrs. Elliot supervised the embroidery, Mehmet remained by the window, gazing out over the frost-rimmed gardens. "The king is uneasy," he said quietly, almost to himself. The Spanish ambassador delays his reply again. There is talk of new alliances being formed without his consent. Mrs. Elliot did not look up from her stitching. And so he looks to the nursery, to symbols of continuity. Mehmet's eyes flicked toward her, sharp with understanding. "Precisely. In times of political uncertainty, royal children become proof of stability." Eliza listened silently, her hands folded on the table. She had long stopped thinking of her duties as simple service. Every act in the nursery, every smile, every report, every ribbon tied, seemed to echo through the palace halls in ways she only half understood. When the handkerchief was finished, Mehmet examined it carefully. The embroidery, tiny blue letters on white silk, caught the light like frost on glass. "Perfect," he said. "You have a steady hand, Miss Hartwell." "Thank you, sir." He smiled faintly, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Keep it steady. The palace rewards those who can remain calm while others panic." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "A word of caution. The Queen's secretary has begun asking questions about my visits here. If she should inquire, you will say only that I deliver messages and nothing more." "Understood." Eliza nodded, heart quickening. "Of course, sir." When he was gone, Mrs. Elliot sighed softly. "There it is again, the dance of visibility and concealment. Poor man, he walks a line thinner than any of us." That evening, after the children were asleep, Eliza carried the folded linen to the laundry room. As she passed through the corridor, she saw Mehmet speaking in hushed tones with one of the upper footmen. They stood close to a candle, their faces half in shadow. "You'll deliver it to the Queen's secretary yourself," Mehmet was saying. "No intermediaries. And not a word of the king's condition. Do you understand?" The footman nodded nervously, clutching a sealed packet. "Yes, sir. Right away." Eliza moved on quietly, pretending not to see, but her thoughts churned. The king's condition? The phrase lingered like a whisper she wasn't meant to hear. Later that night, she gathered the courage to mention it to Mrs. Elliot as they folded the children's gowns. "Is the king ill?" she asked softly. Mrs. Elliot's hands paused mid-fold. "He tires easily these days," she said after a moment. "But in this palace, illness is more political than medical. If word spread that His Majesty weakens, ministers would move before the Queen could steady the court." That's why Mehmet guards his silence so fiercely. Eliza considered this in silence. She had always thought power meant speaking loudly, commanding armies, addressing parliaments, but here she saw that true power often whispered. The next morning brought further proof. A letter arrived from the Queen's apartments, sealed in blue wax. Inside was a single line written in her elegant hand. The king rests well. The children bring him joy. Mrs. Elliot read it with a small, knowing smile. So the message has been received. The gift did its work. Eliza frowned slightly. All that meaning in a handkerchief? Mrs. Elliot looked at her kindly. In a palace, even silence has syntax. A word, a gesture, a piece of cloth, each can carry more truth than a page of letters. That evening, Eliza took a brief walk in the courtyard to clear her thoughts. The lamps burned low, and frost glittered along the stones like spilled diamonds. She thought about Mehmet's face, calm yet burdened, about the king's unseen illness, and about how a child's embroidered initials could steady a kingdom. Standing there beneath the winter stars, she realized that she was no longer merely serving royalty. She was living within the machinery of history itself. She whispered softly, almost prayerfully, "What will the future remember of us? The rulers or the ones who kept their silence?" The wind answered with a sigh through the bare branches, as if the palace itself approved of the question but, as always, refused to reply. The first time Eliza saw Lady Margaret Ashcombe, she mistook her for one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. It was only later she learned that Lady Margaret held no official title, no appointment, no royal signature, but wielded an influence that reached further than many ministers. To the courtiers, she was Her Majesty's companion. To the servants, she was something else entirely, the Queen's shadow. She appeared one quiet morning in the nursery, her presence heralded not by announcement but by the faint scent of violet perfume and the silken hush of her gown. Mrs. Elliot immediately curtsied. "My lady, we did not expect." "No one expects me," Lady Margaret replied with a soft smile. Her voice carried the smooth confidence of one accustomed to listening rather than explaining. "I wish to see how the little ones fare." Eliza stood frozen, uncertain whether to bow or curtsy. Lady Margaret's gaze passed over her briefly, sharp, assessing, yet not unkind. "So this is the young assistant the Queen mentioned," she said, moving closer to the cradle where Princess Augusta slept. Such innocence in her face, and yet the eyes already understand the weight of lineage. She turned to Mrs. Elliot. "Her Majesty often says that the nursery is the true heartbeat of the monarchy. I wonder, Mrs. Elliot, how steady is that heartbeat these days?" Mrs. Elliot's composure never wavered. "Strong and constant, my lady. The children thrive and the staff remain devoted." Lady Margaret smiled again, but this time the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Devotion, yes. Though sometimes devotion hides ambition. Wouldn't you agree?" The question hung like smoke in the air. Eliza felt her breath catch. "I trust only those who serve without hunger," Lady Margaret continued softly, "and those who see without speaking too much of what they see." Her eyes rested briefly on Eliza. The weight of that glance felt heavier than any reprimand. After a moment, she turned toward the window, watching the faint snow falling over the gardens. "The Queen is weary, Mrs. Elliot. The King's condition burdens her more than she admits. I would have her comforted, not surrounded by nervous whispers. You will make certain of that." "Of course, my lady," Mrs. Elliot replied. Lady Margaret adjusted one of the lace curtains with a gloved hand. "It pleases me to know that the nursery remains a place of discretion. I hear the King's valet visits often." Mrs. Elliot's tone was careful. "He brings the King's questions as always." Lady Margaret's smile deepened. "Ah yes, Mehmet. A loyal man, I'm sure. Though loyalty, like silk, can fray unseen." And with that, she turned toward the door. "Do keep the children well, Mrs. Elliot. The Queen sleeps better when her heart rests here." When she had gone, silence filled the room. Mary was the first to speak. "She frightened me." Mrs. Elliot gave a small, tired smile. "She frightens everyone. That's her talent." Eliza stood still, her mind spinning. Lady Margaret's visit had felt like a storm passing through, a gentle breeze on the surface but with thunder beneath. That night, as she helped Mrs. Elliot tidy the nursery, she couldn't resist asking, "Is she dangerous?" Mrs. Elliot paused. "Dangerous is the wrong word. She is necessary. The Queen cannot rule without her counsel. Yet every counsel she gives has a shadow of its own. Eliza frowned. You mean she decides what the Queen believes? In a manner of speaking. Mrs. Elliot folded a small blanket with precise hands. Lady Margaret is the voice that whispers behind the throne. The Queen trusts her entirely, which means everyone else must measure their steps carefully. Even Mehmet. Eliza hesitated. She doesn't like him, does she? No, Mrs. Elliot said softly, because she cannot read him. And what she cannot read, she will eventually try to remove. That night, Eliza dreamed of the Queen's apartments. Long corridors where candlelight flickered against walls of gold, and behind every shadow moved another, feminine, silent, always watching. The following morning, a sealed note arrived in the nursery. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakable. Her Majesty's companion thanks Mrs. Elliot for her vigilance and requests that the Turkish valet no longer enter the nursery unannounced. Mrs. Elliot read it twice, then folded it carefully. So it begins, she murmured. Eliza looked up. What begins? The quiet war of influence, Mrs. Elliot said, between the Queen's shadow and the King's voice. For the first time, Eliza understood that beneath the gentle lullabies and soft toys of the nursery, an invisible battle was being waged, a war fought not with swords but with information, trust, and silence. That evening, as she set the children's shoes by the fire, she whispered to herself, "In this palace, even affection has an agenda." The nursery clock ticked softly in reply. The days after Lady Margaret's visit passed with an uneasy stillness. Nothing appeared different on the surface. The nursery routine continued, the children thrived, and the servants went about their duties as though no shadow had darkened their threshold. Yet beneath the polished calm, Eliza could feel the air shifting. Mehmet's visits grew fewer but sharper in purpose. When he came, he no longer lingered near the window or asked after the children's laughter. His tone was brisk, his gaze colder. He spoke in coded phrases that Mrs. Elliot seemed to understand instinctively. "The Queen's shadow grows longer," he said one afternoon, setting a folded letter upon the table. "The King's words reach her ears before they reach his ministers. That cannot continue." Mrs. Elliot's face remained serene. "You cannot confront her directly. That would only confirm her suspicions." "I have no need to confront," Mehmet replied. "Only to illuminate. Shadows fear light more than blades." He glanced toward Eliza, who was folding napkins near the hearth. "And our newest observer, she sees clearly, I think." Eliza froze under his gaze. "I see what is before me, sir." He smiled faintly. "Then you see more than most courtiers." When he left, Mrs. Elliot watched the closed door for a long moment before speaking. "Lady Margaret intends to isolate him from the Queen. If she succeeds, he will lose access to the King, and by extension, so will we." Eliza frowned. "But we serve the same crown. Why would she want that?" Mrs. Elliot gave a small, weary sigh. "Because in a court like this, service is not unity. Every act of loyalty must be balanced against another's ambition." That evening, when the children were asleep and Mary had retired, Mrs. Elliot poured 2 small cups of tea and motioned for Eliza to sit. "There is something you must understand," she began quietly. "Our network was not created to deceive. It was created to survive. Men like Mehmet, women like myself, outsiders, commoners, foreigners, do not last long in these palaces without allies." Eliza listened closely, her hands folded around the warm porcelain. "When I first came here," Mrs. Elliot continued, "I thought loyalty was simple. Serve faithfully, speak honestly, and all would be well. Then I saw good servants dismissed for being too honest, too loyal to the wrong person. That is when Mehmet and I formed our understanding. We share what others hide. We protect those who would otherwise be crushed between rival powers." Eliza hesitated. "And Lady Margaret?" "Lady Margaret protects only one person, herself. She believes influence must flow through her hands alone. To her, Mehmet's existence is a threat." The candlelight flickered, and shadows danced across the nursery walls. Eliza thought of Lady Margaret's cool gaze, of the faint disdain in her voice when she spoke of ambition among servants. "What can we do?" Eliza asked finally. Mrs. Elliot looked at her for a long moment, weighing something unseen. "Observe. Listen. There are ways to expose truth without speaking it aloud." In the days that followed, Eliza began to notice new movements in the palace corridors. Footmen delivering sealed packets late at night. Letters marked with the Queen's crest, but written in a different hand. Servants whispering about a coming audience with the Cherokee delegation, an event Lady Margaret had taken over from the King's staff. One afternoon, as Eliza was carrying fresh linens to the nursery, she saw Lady Margaret herself in conversation with the Queen's secretary. Their voices were low, but Eliza caught a fragment as she passed. The King's valet should be watched. Foreign blood breeds foreign loyalties. That phrase burned into her mind. That evening, when Mehmet appeared unexpectedly, Eliza told him what she'd heard. He listened in silence, expression unreadable. When she finished, he inclined his head. "You did well to tell me. Words like those can kill reputations faster than poison." He turned to Mrs. Elliot. "The Queen must not believe I act in secret against her interests. We must show her the truth, quietly, undeniably." "How?" Mrs. Elliot asked. Mehmet's gaze shifted toward Eliza. "Through innocence. The Queen trusts the nursery. Let the truth come from there." Eliza blinked. "From me?" "From what you witness," Mehmet said gently. "Lady Margaret believes herself unseen here. She will relax her guard in a room filled with children and women. That is where she will reveal more than she intends." The weight of his request settled upon Eliza's shoulders like a cloak too large to bear. She was a servant, not a spy. And yet, she could not deny the strange sense of purpose it gave her, to act not from ambition, but from protection. That night, unable to sleep, she sat by the window of her small chamber. The palace lights shimmered beyond the gardens like scattered stars. Somewhere within those walls, Lady Margaret moved unseen. Somewhere else, Mehmet planned his next quiet maneuver. And here she sat between them both, the watcher who had once only scrubbed floors. In that moment, she understood the truth Mrs. Elliot had spoken. Power in the palace did not depend on titles or crowns. It depended on who saw what and who chose to remember. The day of the Queen's audience with the Cherokee delegation dawned bright and cold. Even before the sun fully lifted above the palace chimneys, servants were already moving like clockwork, preparing the reception hall. The scent of beeswax polish and damp stone filled the air. From the nursery window, Eliza watched the carriages arrive in the forecourt, horses steaming in the chill, liveried guards standing motionless as diplomats and courtiers stepped down in their finery. She had never seen so many feathers, jewels, and velvet in one place. "Today," Mrs. Elliot murmured beside her, "every gesture becomes history. And history often begins with the smallest witnesses." By royal order, the nursery children were to attend the first portion of the audience as a symbol of peace and continuity. Eliza dressed Prince George and Princess Augusta with careful precision. Their tiny hands and embroidered cuffs were to remind foreign dignitaries that England's power extended not just through armies, but through the promise of future kings. When the Queen's messenger arrived, Mrs. Elliot gathered the staff. "We will accompany the children to the presence chamber. Remember, no speech unless addressed, no eye contact with foreign guests, and above all, no movement that draws attention." Eliza's heart thudded as they followed the long procession through the marble corridors. The halls glowed with candlelight even in morning brightness. The soft rustle of silk and the distant murmur of assembled courtiers rose like the hum of an unseen tide. The presence chamber was already filled when they entered. The Queen sat on a raised dais beneath a canopy embroidered with gold thread, her expression serene but alert. To her right stood Lady Margaret, in silver-gray satin, her poise perfect, her smile polite but distant. Opposite them, the Cherokee delegation waited. Their leader, Chief Tomochichi, stood tall and dignified, dressed in a mixture of traditional garments and English finery. The translator, a young man named Matawaka, bowed low before the Queen. Eliza carried Princess Augusta in her arms as Mrs. Elliot led Prince George by the hand. The Queen's gaze softened at the sight of her grandchildren. "Ah, my little symbols of peace," she said gently. The hall murmured with admiration, but Lady Margaret's eyes flickered toward Eliza. A subtle reminder, remember your place. As the ceremony began, the chief spoke through Matawaka's careful translation. "We come in friendship," he said, "to honor promises made and to carry words of peace across the sea." The Queen inclined her head. "England welcomes such friendship. We believe in bonds that endure." Lady Margaret stepped forward smoothly, her tone honeyed. "Her Majesty wishes to assure your people that our hearts and hands remain open." The royal children's presence today is proof of our goodwill." Her words flowed effortlessly, but Eliza noticed the faint tightening of Matawaka's jaw, the translator adjusting phrasing to maintain dignity without offense. Then something unexpected happened. Prince George, restless from standing, tugged at Eliza's sleeve. She leaned down, whispering softly to quiet him, but the boy reached toward Matawaka's feathered ornament. A ripple of polite laughter spread through the court. "Curious, is he not?" Lady Margaret said lightly, already eager to grasp foreign treasures. Matawaka smiled, but his eyes held something unreadable. "Among my people, a child's curiosity is a blessing. It means his spirit seeks understanding." The Queen's lips curved faintly, but Lady Margaret's smile faltered for the briefest second. Eliza felt it, an invisible shift in the room. For all her control, Lady Margaret had underestimated the subtle dignity of those she spoke to. As the exchange continued, Eliza caught sight of Mehmet at the far end of the hall, standing among the king's attendants. His eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement, no more. He had not been expected here. When the ceremony ended, applause and murmurs filled the chamber. Gifts were exchanged: silver ornaments, woven cloths, and a miniature portrait of the royal children. Eliza stepped back with Mrs. Elliot, cradling Princess Augusta once more. As the crowd dispersed, she overheard fragments of conversation. Courtiers commenting on the Queen's grace, ministers whispering about alliances. But one voice carried clearly behind her. Lady Margaret, speaking softly to the Queen, "Your Majesty handled them perfectly. Though one wonders if His Majesty's valet was needed here. Foreign faces observing foreign guests. How delicate." The Queen replied coolly, "Mehmet has served our family longer than most of my ministers. His presence comforts me." That was enough. The faintest crack in Lady Margaret's composure appeared, gone in a heartbeat, but Eliza saw it. Later that evening, when the palace returned to its quiet rhythm, Mehmet visited the nursery under pretext of checking on the children. He stood by the cradle watching the sleeping princess. "You saw it," he said softly. "Yes," Eliza replied. "The Queen defended you." He nodded once. "That is the first light through her shadow." Mrs. Elliot joined them at the window where moonlight glimmered on the frost. "Lady Margaret will not forgive it easily." "No," Mehmet said. But now, the Queen knows there are truths that reach her ears from beyond her companion's whispers. Eliza looked between them, realizing that what she had witnessed was not merely an audience. It was a quiet turning of the tide. "Do you think peace will hold?" she asked. Mehmet's eyes softened. "Peace never holds, child. It must be tended the way Mrs. Elliot tends these children, patiently, quietly, every day." Outside, the bells of Hampton Court told the hour. The audience had ended, but its echo lingered through the corridors, carried not by diplomats or kings, but by servants who understood that history was written in gestures no one else remembered. It was past midnight when Eliza found herself walking alone through the servants' passage that joined the nursery to the western wing of Hampton Court. The lamps had burned low, their light soft as candle smoke. Somewhere below, the river murmured like a dream half remembered. She had gone to fetch a blanket left behind in the laundry, nothing more. Yet that simple errand drew her into something she was never meant to hear. As she rounded the corner near the Queen's private antechamber, she froze. Two voices drifted through the narrow gap of an unlatched door. "The King's health declines more rapidly than we are told," said a man's voice, measured, foreign, with the faint rhythm of France in it. Then a woman's reply, unmistakably calm and cool, "Lady Margaret, you overestimate the King's strength and the Queen's will. A woman ruled by sentiment is easily guided. When His Majesty's condition becomes public, Parliament will turn its loyalty toward the heir, and that is where we must plant the seed." The man chuckled softly. "And who will water it, my lady?" "I will," she said, through the Queen's ear, through every whisper she hears at her bedside. England must choose continuity, not chaos, and continuity requires guidance. The pause that followed was long enough for Eliza's heartbeat to thunder in her ears. When the man spoke again, his tone carried amusement. "And what of the King's valet, the Turk? He guards the Queen's sympathies more closely than any minister." Lady Margaret's answer was silk over steel. "Leave him to me. A single word from the right mouth can stain even the purest loyalty." Eliza leaned closer, her hand against the cold stone. The man continued, The delegation from the New World trusts the Queen. They believe their treaty is safe. Let them believe it, Lady Margaret said sharply. It keeps them docile. Once the king is gone, new terms will be drawn. England's interests must come before promises to savages. Eliza bit her lip to keep from gasping. She felt the words strike her like a blow, not only for their cruelty but for the danger they implied. The Queen's promise of peace, the friendship symbolized by the children's presence, was being twisted into a weapon. The conversation ended abruptly. Footsteps approached. Eliza ducked behind a tapestry just as the door opened. Lady Margaret stepped into the corridor, her face half lit by candlelight. She was followed by a tall man in a diplomat's cloak, the French ambassador, his jeweled sash glinting faintly. Their steps echoed down the passage until the sound dissolved into silence. Eliza waited, counting heartbeats, before slipping away toward the nursery. When she arrived, the room was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Mrs. Elliot, half awake in her chair, stirred at the sound of the door. "Eliza? What is it?" Eliza hesitated, trembling. "I heard something near the Queen's chambers. Lady Margaret, she was with the French ambassador. They spoke of the king's health and of changing the treaty." Mrs. Elliot's face hardened, the calm mask slipping just enough for Eliza to see the fear beneath. "Are you certain?" "Yes, ma'am. Every word." Mrs. Elliot stood, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Then the game is deeper than we thought." Eliza swallowed. "Should we tell Mehmet?" "Not yet," Mrs. Elliot said. "If Lady Margaret moves too soon, we must have proof. Otherwise, she will turn the Queen against us." She glanced toward the sleeping children, her expression softening. "We protect them first. Always the children." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Every creak of the old palace felt like footsteps, every flicker of candlelight like a watching eye. At dawn, as the first pale light touched the nursery windows, a soft knock came at the door. It was Mehmet. His coat was dusted with frost, his expression grave. "The king has taken ill," he said quietly. He collapsed after a late meeting. "The Queen has ordered all servants to remain at their posts until further notice." Eliza and Mrs. Elliot exchanged a glance. Neither spoke, but both understood what this meant. Lady Margaret's words from the night before rang in Eliza's memory. When His Majesty's condition becomes public, Parliament will turn its loyalty toward the heir. And somewhere in the heart of the palace, a web of whispers began to tighten. Mehmet's gaze shifted to Eliza. "You look troubled. Have you seen something?" Eliza hesitated, then shook her head. "Only shadows, sir." Mehmet studied her face for a moment, as though he knew there was more left unsaid. But he only nodded. "Then be watchful of them. In this palace, shadows have teeth." When he left, Mrs. Elliot turned to Eliza. "You did right to keep silent, for now. But remember what you heard. One day, the truth must have a voice, and it may have to be yours." Eliza looked toward the cradle, where Princess Augusta stirred in her sleep. "If the king dies," she whispered, "what will happen to them?" Mrs. Elliot's answer was soft, almost prayerful. "Then the nursery will become the kingdom's heart, and the battlefield both." Outside, the palace bells began to toll. Not for death, not yet, but for something that sounded eerily close to it, the moment before everything changes. The next morning, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Servants moved in hushed rhythm. Courtiers spoke in whispers that dissolved into silence when footsteps approached. Even the bells that marked the hours seemed to ring more softly, as though unwilling to disturb whatever unseen force now hovered over Hampton Court. The king was ill. No official word was given, of course. The royal physicians came and went through the back staircases, avoiding the public corridors. Curtains were drawn in the king's apartments, and guards doubled their watch. But in a palace where information flowed like air through the cracks of stone, secrecy only made the truth louder. By noon, the rumors had already reached the kitchens, the stables, the nursery. Eliza heard them while fetching milk from the servants' pantry. "They say he fell in the council chamber," whispered one footman. "Collapsed right at the map table, clutching his chest." "Or his mind," said another. "He hasn't been the same since the treaty talks. Some say the Turks poisoned him." Eliza slipped away before they could notice her listening. The words, "the Turks," still echoed in her ears as she climbed the nursery stairs. Inside, Mrs. Elliot was already at her post, calm but pale. The children played quietly under Mary's supervision, unaware that the air around them had changed. "Mehmet has not returned since dawn," Mrs. Elliot said in a low tone. "He's been confined to the outer chambers near the king's rooms." Lady Margaret insisted on restricting access. Eliza's heart sank. "She's blaming him." Mrs. Elliot nodded grimly. "It begins exactly as we feared." That afternoon, a formal notice was delivered to the nursery by a young page. He bowed stiffly and recited from memory. "By Her Majesty's order, the royal children shall remain within their quarters until further instruction. No visitors are to be admitted without written approval from the Queen's companion, Lady Margaret Ashcombe." Mrs. Elliot accepted the parchment without comment. When the boy left, she folded it carefully and placed it on her writing desk. "So she controls the gates now," she said softly. Eliza stared at the document. "What will we do?" Mrs. Elliot's eyes met hers. "We keep the nursery steady. The children must not sense fear. And you, observe everything. Who comes, who lingers, who avoids our corridor." That night, as snow began to fall outside the high windows, Eliza helped Mary settle the children into bed. Prince George, restless and clever beyond his years, looked up from his pillow. "Why does everyone whisper?" he asked. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, my prince," Eliza said softly. "The palace is only quiet tonight. Everyone is tired." He frowned. "Is Grandpapa sick?" Eliza froze. She had not realized how quickly word traveled, even among children. "He's resting," she said after a pause. "The doctors are helping him." Prince George nodded solemnly, then reached for her hand. "When I'm king, I won't let anyone whisper. I'll make them tell the truth." Eliza smiled faintly. "Then you'll be a rare king indeed." When the children slept, she sat by the hearth with Mrs. Elliot. The older woman's face was drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The Queen has not come," she murmured. "In times of illness, she always visits the nursery for comfort. But now she stays in her chambers. Lady Margaret keeps her surrounded." Eliza hesitated before speaking. If the Queen knew what Lady Margaret said last night, about the king's condition and the treaty, she would never allow it. Mrs. Elliot looked at her sharply. "Careful. Knowledge is dangerous until the right moment. If you speak too soon, you will be silenced." The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the sleeping nursery. Eliza gazed into the flames, her thoughts swirling like smoke. She wondered what Mehmet was doing now, if he was still at the king's bedside, or if Lady Margaret had already turned suspicion upon him. At dawn, a message arrived. A single folded note bearing Mehmet's seal, smuggled through a laundry maid. "The king sleeps, neither living nor gone. Trust no one who enters by candlelight." Eliza read it twice before handing it to Mrs. Elliot. "What does he mean?" Mrs. Elliot frowned. "He means the court waits for death, but cannot announce it until it knows who will hold power when it comes. And as for the candlelight, he warns us that Lady Margaret's agents move at night." Later that morning, Lady Margaret herself appeared. Her gown was black silk trimmed with silver thread, as if mourning something not yet lost. She smiled as she entered. Such sweet peace in this room. One might forget the troubles of the world outside. Mrs. Elliot curtsied. "We do our best, my lady." Lady Margaret's eyes drifted toward the sleeping Princess Augusta. "How innocent they are. It must be comforting to care for those untouched by deceit." Her gaze lingered a moment too long on Eliza. Though innocence is so fragile, a single misplaced word can destroy it. Eliza bowed her head, pulse racing. When Lady Margaret left, Mrs. Elliot exhaled slowly. "She knows we know something, but she doesn't know what." Eliza looked toward the sealed note hidden in her apron. "Then she'll keep trying to find out." "Let her," Mrs. Elliot said quietly. "Every hunter leaves footprints in the snow. All we must do is follow them." Outside, the snowfall thickened, blanketing the palace grounds in white silence. And within that hush, the fate of kings and servants alike waited, suspended between breath and prayer. For 3 days, the palace lay under a hush so heavy it seemed to press upon the walls. The king remained unseen, his condition sealed behind closed doors. Couriers came and went through the rear gates, their cloaks dusted with snow, their faces grim. Ministers requested audiences and were denied. It was as though the entire kingdom balanced on the fragile rhythm of a dying man's breath. Inside the nursery, life continued with deliberate calm. The children played, ate, and slept according to schedule. But even they sensed the tension that trembled beneath the quiet. On the fourth evening, the queen came. No heralds announced her. She appeared in the doorway just as the lamps were being lit, a tall figure in deep blue velvet, her face pale from sleeplessness. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Mrs. Elliot dropped into a curtsy so low it seemed she might never rise again. "Your Majesty," she whispered. "Please," the queen said softly. "No ceremony tonight." Her voice was weary but steady. She moved to the cradle where Princess Augusta slept, brushing a gentle hand over the child's curls. Then she turned to the window, gazing out at the white gardens below. "How peaceful it looks," she murmured. "As if the world itself forgets that kings can die." No one spoke. The queen turned to Mrs. Elliot. "They tell me you keep this place in perfect order, even in troubled times." Mrs. Elliot bowed her head modestly. "It is my duty, Your Majesty." "And your solace, perhaps," the queen said, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "When the rest of the palace trembles, the nursery remains steady. I envy that." Then for the first time her gaze shifted to Eliza. "You are the new attendant, yes? The one my husband's valet recommended." "Yes, Your Majesty," Eliza replied, curtsying. "I am honored to serve." The queen studied her a moment longer. "Mehmet speaks highly of you. I trust his judgment. He is an unusual man, but a loyal one." Mrs. Elliot said carefully, "He has served both Your Majesty and His Majesty faithfully." The queen nodded absently. "Yes, and yet some in my court whisper otherwise." Her tone hardened slightly. "Tell me, Mrs. Elliot, do you believe everyone around me speaks truth?" Mrs. Elliot hesitated. The question was dangerous. It was also an invitation. "Not everyone, Your Majesty," she said at last. "Some speak what they think Your Majesty wishes to hear." The queen's eyes narrowed, though not in anger. "And what of Lady Margaret? What does she think I wish to hear?" Silence. Only the ticking of the clock filled the air. Finally, Eliza spoke without meaning to. "She tells you the king is improving, Your Majesty. But he is not." The words hung between them like a drawn curtain. Mrs. Elliot turned sharply, but the queen held up a hand. "Go on, child." Eliza's throat went dry. "I overheard her speaking with the French ambassador. She said the king's illness would soon turn Parliament's loyalty toward the heir, and that new terms would be made for the treaty. I swear, Your Majesty, I heard it with my own ears." For a long moment, the queen said nothing. Her face was unreadable, carved from quiet grief. Then she turned back to the window, her reflection pale against the dark glass. "I have always known Margaret was ambitious. I did not wish to believe she would go so far." She looked at Mrs. Elliot. "Does Mehmet know?" Mrs. Elliot inclined her head. "He suspects, but he has been confined since the king's collapse." "Of course," the queen said bitterly. "Margaret ensures that every loyal voice is silenced first." She began to pace slowly, the hem of her gown brushing against the nursery floor. "When I married a king, I thought I entered a world of grandeur. I did not understand that every crown sits upon a battlefield." Then she stopped, turning toward Eliza. "You risked much by telling me this." Eliza bowed deeply. "I could not remain silent, Your Majesty. The truth belongs to you." The queen's expression softened. "No, my dear. The truth belongs to no one. It lives where courage dares to speak." She reached for the quill on Mrs. Elliot's desk and wrote a single line on a folded sheet of parchment. "Take this to Mehmet," she said. "Use the back corridor near the kitchens. No one must see you." Eliza took the letter carefully. The royal seal glimmered red under candlelight. The queen placed a hand on her shoulder. "Tell him, the queen no longer sleeps in shadows." As Eliza slipped away through the narrow passageways, her heart beat wildly, not with fear but with something sharper, brighter. For the first time she felt the weight of history tilt. The queen had awakened. And in the still halls of Hampton Court, where whispers once ruled, a single truth had begun to stir, quiet as dawn, unstoppable as light. Eliza moved quickly through the servants' corridor, her fingers clutching the queen's letter as though it were a flame that might burn through her skin. The air in the passage was cold, scented faintly of smoke from the kitchen hearths below. Her footsteps echoed softly against the flagstones. Each shadow seemed deeper than it should be, each corner alive with the possibility of discovery. She kept her head low, repeating the queen's words in her mind. No one must see you. At the far end of the corridor, she turned toward the back stair. The way led through the service hall, usually empty at this hour, but tonight, a faint light flickered beyond the archway. Voices murmured. Eliza stopped. I tell you, Lady Margaret ordered it herself, said a man's voice, hurried and uncertain. All correspondence leaving the Queen's wing must be inspected. Another voice, cool, composed, unmistakably Lady Margaret's, answered. The Queen's grief makes her vulnerable. We protect her by protecting her words. Eliza's heart froze. She pressed herself against the wall as Lady Margaret stepped into view, holding a taper candle that threw sharp light across her features. Her expression was calm, almost serene, the way a falcon looks serene just before it strikes. A footman followed behind her, carrying a small silver tray. On it lay several sealed envelopes, the red wax glinting faintly. Place them on the table, Lady Margaret said. We burn anything that smells of foreign counsel, or the Turk's influence. Eliza's breath caught. The Queen's letter in her hand suddenly felt heavy, dangerous. The footman obeyed. Lady Margaret examined one envelope, then another, her eyes sharp as she broke the seals and skimmed the contents. With each letter read, she nodded slightly and dropped it into the fire. The wax hissed, paper curling into ash. Then she paused. This one bears the Queen's own seal. Who delivered it? A kitchen maid, my lady, the footman said. Said she was told it was for the King's valet. Lady Margaret's lips curved faintly. Ah, so the game continues. She held the letter over the flame. The wax softened, and for a moment, the royal crest gleamed before darkening. Eliza watched helplessly as the paper caught, curling into orange light, the Queen's words, her courage, vanishing into smoke. When the flame had consumed it entirely, Lady Margaret turned to the footman. See that no message leaves the Queen's hand without my sight, and keep watch on the nursery. That is where the whispers grow loudest. Eliza's stomach twisted. She forced herself to breathe slowly, silently. When Lady Margaret and her servant finally departed, she slipped out of her hiding place and hurried down the stair. The kitchens were empty now, the great hearth glowing with low embers. She reached the narrow door leading toward the King's quarters but stopped. If Lady Margaret had burned the letter, Mehmet would never know. Unless... Her eyes caught a small scrap of paper near the ashes. The corner of the Queen's stationery, half charred, but one line still legible in her graceful hand. The Queen no longer sleeps in shadows. Eliza folded it carefully and tucked it into her sleeve. By the time she reached the servants' landing outside Mehmet's antechamber, the palace felt colder than before. A guard stood by the door. No entry, he said curtly. By Lady Margaret's order. Eliza forced calm into her voice. It's only a message for the valet, Her Majesty's instructions for the King's medicine. The guard frowned. All such orders go through Lady Margaret now. I understand, Eliza said quickly, lowering her eyes. But the Queen asked that it be delivered to him directly. It concerns the children. At the mention of the children, the guard hesitated. He finally stepped aside. Be quick. Inside, Mehmet sat by a small fire, his face drawn from exhaustion. He rose immediately when he saw her. Eliza? Why are you here? She showed him the burned scrap. The Queen sent a letter. Lady Margaret intercepted it. This was all that survived. Mehmet took the fragment, reading the single line slowly. His eyes darkened. So the Queen sees now. She wanted you to know, Eliza said. But the message is gone. He shook his head. Not gone. Burned words still leave smoke. And smoke leaves scent. Enough for those who can follow it. He moved to the table and began writing quickly on a slip of parchment. We cannot move openly yet. The Queen's awakening is a threat to Lady Margaret's hold. She will act soon, and we must be ready. Eliza hesitated. How? Mehmet's gaze lifted to hers. By remembering what she cannot destroy, the truth carried by those unseen. Servants, watchers, mothers, you. He folded the note and pressed it into her hand. Hide this beneath the cradle of the princess. If they search my rooms, they will not find it there. And if they ask, you know nothing. Eliza nodded. Her fingers trembled as she took the note. As she turned to leave, Mehmet spoke softly behind her. The king may die, Eliza. But remember this, the queen's heart lives where the children sleep. Guard that heart. Back in the nursery, the fire burned low. The children slept, their faces peaceful, untouched by the storm gathering beyond their door. Eliza slipped the folded note beneath Princess Augusta's cradle and whispered into the darkness. For every letter burned, another will survive. And outside, the winter wind swept through the palace chimneys, carrying the faint scent of smoke and rebellion. 2 days passed. The snow thickened over Hampton Court, muting every sound except the occasional creak of ice beneath the eaves. The palace seemed frozen between worlds, caught between a reign that refused to end and another that dared not begin. The king was still alive, though few had seen him. The physicians spoke of restful sleep, but the servants whispered of something colder. In the kitchens the talk grew bold. They say he hasn't opened his eyes in 3 days. Then why do they keep the bells silent? Because the queen still waits for a miracle. Eliza heard it all as she carried linens through the corridors. She had learned to keep her head bowed, to let words slide over her like water over stone. But one phrase clung to her like a burr: the Turk will hang when the king dies. By evening she could no longer contain her fear. She went to Mrs. Elliott's small chamber behind the nursery. The older woman sat by the fire, mending a child's gown, her face calm as always, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "Is it true?" Eliza asked softly. "They'll accuse him?" Mrs. Elliott didn't look up. "They already have. Lady Margaret says the king was poisoned with foreign herbs. Mehmet's medicine, of course. But he was trying to save him." Mrs. Elliott sighed. Truth has little meaning when fear needs a target. She set aside the gown and met Eliza's eyes. "Listen to me carefully. If the king dies before dawn, Lady Margaret will control everything. The queen's access, the succession, even the nursery. We cannot allow that." Eliza swallowed hard. "What can we do?" Mrs. Elliott reached into the drawer of her writing desk and drew out a small tin box. Inside lay the remains of the queen's burned letter. The same royal seal, half melted, resting among ashes. "This is proof," she said. "Proof that Lady Margaret intercepted the queen's words. The wax bears her servant's fingerprint, not the queen's. But it must reach the queen before Lady Margaret declares the king dead." Eliza stared at the box. "You trust me to take it?" "I trust no one else," Mrs. Elliott said quietly. "You move unseen. And you believe in something larger than fear." That night, as the household slept uneasily, Eliza wrapped herself in a plain cloak and stepped into the corridor. The moon shone faintly through high windows, lighting her way in silver and shadow. She knew the guards' routes now, the timing of their shifts. The palace had taught her to listen, to footsteps, to doors, to the heartbeat of the place itself. As she reached the queen's wing, voices drifted from beyond the door. Lady Margaret's tones, sharp and low. "It is time, Your Majesty. The court waits for confirmation. We must make the announcement before dawn." The queen's voice, weaker but firm. "You mean before I see my husband?" "His Majesty no longer recognizes anyone," Lady Margaret said. "It would be unkind to force the sight upon you." "I am still his wife," the queen replied. There was a pause, then the sound of fabric rustling, as though Lady Margaret bowed reluctantly. "As you wish, Your Majesty. I shall arrange it." Eliza pressed herself against the cold stone wall, heart hammering. She waited until footsteps faded down the opposite corridor before slipping through the side door that led to the royal chapel. From there she could reach the queen's chamber unseen. The chapel smelled of wax and old prayers. Candles burned along the altar, their flames steady in the still air. Kneeling before the front pew was Mehmet. His coat was torn, his hair disheveled, but his posture remained proud. He turned as she entered, surprise flashing in his tired eyes. "Eliza," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here." "I have something for the queen," she said, holding out the small box. "Proof that Lady Margaret burned her letter. Mrs. Elliott said you'd know how to deliver it." Mehmet took the box, opening it briefly. When he saw the royal seal, his jaw tightened. So the queen's own words turned to ash. Fitting, perhaps, for the fire she now faces. He looked at her with a strange, weary fondness. "You've done more for England tonight than most who wear titles." Then he rose, straightened his coat, and said, "Come. The queen must hear this before dawn." They moved together through the side passages, the queen's guards bowing them through in silence. Whether from loyalty or confusion, Eliza could not tell. Inside the queen's chamber, the air smelled of lavender and candle smoke. The queen sat by the hearth, her eyes shadowed but clear. Mehmet bowed deeply, presenting the tin box. "Your Majesty, what was burned now speaks again." The queen opened it, studying the half-melted seal. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with quiet finality, she whispered, "So the fire has shown me my enemy." Her gaze lifted to Mehmet and then to Eliza. "If my husband dies tonight, Lady Margaret will move before sunrise. We must be ready. Gather those who still serve truth. You have my word, my crown will not hide behind hers again." Eliza felt a shiver run through her, not of fear but of something close to reverence. In that small circle of light, among ashes and oaths, the queen, the servant, and the foreigner stood as equals. And for the first time, the palace no longer seemed a prison of gold, but a battlefield lit by conscience. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying faint tolls from the chapel bell. The hour of reckoning had begun. The bell rang at dawn. Not the brisk toll of morning prayer, nor the bright chime that marked royal arrivals. This sound was deeper, slower, drawn out as if each note carried a heartbeat to its grave. Across the courtyards and galleries of Hampton Court, the world stilled. Servants stopped mid-step, footmen turned from their posts, and the echo rolled like thunder down the marble halls. The king was dead. Eliza stood in the nursery doorway, her hands gripping the frame. The sound of the bell seemed to press against her chest. She had never known a monarch personally, but now she felt as though she were standing at the edge of something immense and invisible, the end of a breath the entire nation had been holding. In the room behind her, Mrs. Elliot knelt by the cradle, murmuring a prayer. The children slept still, their dreams untouched by the toll that would shape their lives. Mehmet entered quietly, his black coat marked with candle soot. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the dull gleam of someone who had not slept in days. "It is done," he said softly. Eliza looked at him. Was she with him? He nodded. The queen sat by his side until the end. She held his hand when the breath left him. No priest, no ministers, only her. He hesitated before adding, "Lady Margaret stood outside the door, waiting to take the keys of state." Mrs. Elliot rose, her hands trembling only slightly. "She will move quickly now. Every letter, every document will pass through her hands before the funeral is announced." "She already has," Mehmet said grimly. "She summoned the Privy Council before sunrise. Her claim is that the queen is unfit for governance in her grief." Eliza felt anger rise like heat beneath her skin. Unfit? She was the only one who stayed with him. Mehmet looked at her, and in his weary eyes she saw both sadness and pride. "You have fire in you, Eliza. Hold it, but never let them see it burn." A knock came, a soft, deliberate sound. Mrs. Elliot opened the door to reveal one of the kitchen boys, pale and breathless. "Message from Her Majesty," he whispered, pressing a folded parchment into her hand. The queen's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant but hurried. "The council meets at noon. Lady Margaret intends to name a regent in my stead. Gather those loyal. The children must remain unseen until I summon them. Cr." Mrs. Elliot looked up. "She's making her stand." Mehmet's jaw tightened. "Then so must we." He turned to Eliza. "Go to the servants' wing. Find Sarah Mitchell, the Duchess's maid. Tell her the Queen calls on the old agreement." Eliza nodded. "The network." "Yes," Mehmet said. "The eyes and ears she cannot silence." As Eliza hurried through the corridors, the palace pulsed with restrained chaos. Courtiers whispered behind gloved hands. Guards adjusted their halberds with nervous precision. Somewhere far off, church bells began to echo the palace's mournful toll, London already awakening to its new age. In the servants' hall, Sarah Mitchell sat with a cup of untouched tea, her face pale. When Eliza delivered the Queen's message, she stood at once. "Tell her we remember." By mid-morning, a quiet procession of servants, valets, nursemaids, scribes, cooks, began to move like a hidden tide through the back corridors. Each carried small signs of allegiance, a folded handkerchief, a ribbon of white. Not rebellion, balance. The council chamber, when the Queen entered, was already full. Lords stood in clusters, their powdered wigs gleaming under the chandeliers. At the far end, Lady Margaret stood beside the empty throne, her expression solemn, her gown the color of storm clouds. "Your Majesty," she said, voice soft but commanding, "we grieve with you. Yet grief cannot govern. For the sake of the realm, the council proposes a regency, until His Highness the Prince comes of age." The Queen's voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall. "And who, my lady, would govern in my stead?" Lady Margaret inclined her head gracefully. "It has been suggested that I continue to advise the crown as I have served it." A murmur rippled through the chamber. At the edge of the room, Mehmet stepped forward. "Her Majesty has no need of a regent," he said clearly. "The law grants her full authority until the heir ascends. And she has the loyalty of every servant in this palace, those who guard her children, her home, and her honor." Lady Margaret's eyes flashed. "A servant dares speak in council?" But before she could continue, the great doors opened. The Queen entered fully, flanked by two nursemaids, Mrs. Elliot and Eliza, each carrying one of the royal children. The sight silenced the room. The Queen's voice did not rise, yet every man heard it. "These are the heirs you would claim to protect," she said. "And I, their grandmother, stand as the bridge between what was and what must come. England does not need a regent. It needs its conscience." She looked directly at Lady Margaret. "And I have found mine again." For the first time, Lady Margaret faltered. The council bowed. The Queen turned to Mehmet and Mrs. Elliot. "Take the children back to the nursery," she said gently. "History has work to do." As they left the hall, Eliza heard the bells begin again, this time not in mourning but in transition. The night of the bell had ended, and in its echo, the quiet power of servants, mothers and watchers began to write the next chapter of the crown. The Queen's words spread through the palace like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. By evening, even the coldest corridors seemed warmer, and servants who had once walked with lowered eyes now lifted their heads again. Yet for all the quiet triumph that day had brought, Eliza sensed the danger had not passed. Lady Margaret had vanished. No one saw her leave the council chamber, and no carriage was reported departing through the palace gates. But her presence lingered like a perfume that refused to fade. Every servant, every guard, every whisperer in the Queen's household knew she would not accept defeat in silence. That night, the nursery was wrapped in a deeper stillness than usual. The snow had stopped falling. Frost etched delicate patterns across the window panes. Eliza sat near the hearth, mending a child's blanket, when the latch turned quietly. A figure stepped inside. "Lock the door, Miss Hartwell," came the voice. It was Lady Margaret. Her hair was unbound, her gown dark and travel-stained. But her eyes still carried that familiar, terrible calm. Eliza rose slowly, heart pounding. "My lady, you're not permitted." "Spare me the formalities," Lady Margaret interrupted. "I have come not for permission, but for truth." She moved closer, her steps deliberate. The flickering firelight caught the edge of her face, half in light, half in shadow. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell," she said softly, "did you think you could wound me with your whispers? That a maid's tongue could topple years of influence?" "I said nothing untrue," Eliza replied, though her voice trembled. "Truth," Lady Margaret said, smiling faintly. "A word for poets and fools. The Queen believes herself awakened, but her eyes still see what I allow her to see. You, however," she leaned closer, "you have seen too much." For a moment, Eliza thought she might call for help. But the children stirred in their sleep, and the thought of waking them froze her voice. Lady Margaret extended a gloved hand. "Give me the proof. The Queen's seal, the ashes." "You have it." Eliza stepped back. "I don't." Lady Margaret's eyes flickered with irritation. "Lies do not suit you. Where is it?" Before Eliza could answer, the door opened again. Mrs. Elliot stood there, holding a candle. Her face was calm, but her voice carried iron beneath the softness. "Leave this room, my lady. The Queen forbade your presence near the children." Lady Margaret's expression shifted, surprise, then disdain. "And you presume to command me?" "I presume to protect what the Queen loves," Mrs. Elliot said. "That includes the children, and the truth." The older woman's composure unnerved even Lady Margaret. For the first time, her certainty faltered. "Do you think your loyalty matters?" she hissed. "When they write the histories, no one will remember your names." "Perhaps," Mrs. Elliot said gently, "but we will have lived honestly within them." At that, the door opened once more. Mehmet stepped inside, silent as the wind. His dark coat was dusted with snow, his eyes fixed on Lady Margaret. "My lady," he said softly, "you have lost." She turned toward him, fury flashing like steel. "You think a servant's word can undo mine? That the queen will discard the woman who built her reign?" "The queen no longer builds with shadows," Mehmet said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded parchment, the same one Eliza had hidden beneath the cradle. "Your servant's fingerprint. Your seal upon the queen's letter. Your crime recorded in the ashes you tried to destroy." Lady Margaret stared at it, her face pale. "You had no right." "Nor did you," he said. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Only the fire spoke, crackling softly. Then Lady Margaret laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Do you think this will save you? The queen will tire of virtue soon enough. They always do." She turned toward the door, straightening her gown as though it were a cloak of armor. "Tell her I leave of my own accord. And tell her this," she looked directly at Eliza. "A crown may survive treason but never innocence. Protect yours if you can." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Mrs. Elliot let out a slow breath. She will flee to France. That's where they all go when their power fades. Mehmet nodded. The queen will declare her exile before sunrise. Eliza sank into her chair, her knees trembling. "It's over?" "For now," Mrs. Elliot said. "But shadows have long memories." Mehmet glanced toward the cradle where the children slept. "Then we must keep the light burning." Eliza looked at him. "Will they remember her?" He smiled faintly. "History forgets faces, not choices. And tonight you chose courage." Outside, the frost on the window began to melt as dawn approached, thin rays of gold cutting through the last of the night. The shadow had fallen, but the light, fragile and human, had endured. Morning broke pale and cold over Hampton Court. The snow on the lawns had turned to a sheet of glass, reflecting the dull gold of the rising sun. Bells tolled again, this time not for death but for renewal. Eliza stood among the gathered servants at the edge of the great hall, her hands clasped tightly, her breath forming faint ghosts in the chill air. The queen had summoned everyone, from chambermaids to courtiers, to witness the formal declaration. At the far end of the hall stood the throne, still draped in black for the late king. Before it, Lady Margaret knelt. She was composed, her hair bound neatly once more, her face serene as marble. Only her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a woman whose empire of whispers had finally collapsed. The queen entered in silence, her mourning veil lifted, her expression clear and regal. Behind her, Mehmet and Mrs. Elliot walked with quiet dignity, carrying no symbols of rank, only the calm assurance of those who had endured. When the queen reached the dais, she looked down at Lady Margaret. For a long moment, neither spoke. At last, the queen said softly, "You served me faithfully once, Margaret, and for that I do not forget. But loyalty that turns to control is no service at all." Lady Margaret's voice was low but steady. "I only sought to protect the realm from chaos, Your Majesty." The queen's gaze did not waver. "You sought to protect your own reflection in its crown." A ripple of murmurs swept through the court. "You intercepted my letters, twisted my words, and attempted to rule through silence," the queen continued. "Yet it was through silence that your deceit was undone. The hands you dismissed as unworthy, these hands," she gestured toward the servants standing in the hall, "carried truth when the mighty would not." Lady Margaret raised her chin slightly. "And what would you have of me now, Your Majesty? Confession? Humiliation?" "No," said the queen, her voice gentler than anyone expected. "Only departure." She nodded toward Mehmet, who stepped forward and unrolled a parchment. "By command of the crown," he read, "Lady Margaret Ashcombe is hereby relieved of her duties and ordered to retire from court. She shall have safe passage to France, where she may live as she chooses, under oath never to correspond with the English throne again." A silence followed, heavy, final. Lady Margaret bowed her head, not in submission, but in something that looked like weary recognition. "Then England will have her peace," she said softly, "though peace, like truth, is never without cost." She rose, gathered her cloak, and walked past the rows of servants. As she passed Eliza, their eyes met. For the briefest moment, there was neither hatred nor regret, only a faint, tragic understanding. Then she was gone. The great doors closed behind her, the echo rolling through the hall like the last note of a requiem. The Queen turned to face her people. Her expression softened. "The court has long been ruled by fear," she said. "By those who speak loudest and trust least. That ends today." She descended the dais and stood among them, among her servants, her guardians, her witnesses. "From this day forward," she continued, "truth shall not be weighed by birth or by title. It shall be measured by courage. For I have learned that crowns may glitter, but it is the unseen who hold them steady." Her eyes found Eliza in the crowd. Miss Hartwell stepped forward. Eliza froze, but Mrs. Elliot gave her a gentle nod. She walked slowly toward the Queen, heart pounding. The Queen smiled faintly. "You risked all to carry a message that never reached its reader, and yet it spoke louder than any letter. The crown remembers." She turned to Mehmet. "And you, who stood loyal in the face of accusation. The realm remembers you too." The Queen's gaze returned to Eliza. "I name you keeper of the nursery, guardian not only of my grandchildren's sleep, but of their truth." Eliza knelt, trembling. "Your Majesty, I am only a servant." The Queen placed a hand on her shoulder. "So am I, child. Only my master is called England." A soft murmur swept through the hall, something between awe and relief. When the ceremony ended, the servants dispersed quietly, their faces alight with cautious hope. Outside, as the Queen's carriage prepared to depart for Windsor with the royal children, Mrs. Elliot turned to Eliza. "You've changed history in your own small way." Eliza shook her head, smiling faintly. "No, I just did what I thought right." Mrs. Elliot smiled back. "That, my dear, is precisely how history is made." The Queen appeared at the carriage window, the baby princess in her arms. "Miss Hartwell," she called softly, "you have my promise. Your light will not be forgotten." The horses began to move, wheels crunching over frost. And as the carriage disappeared beyond the gate, Eliza stood in the pale morning light, watching the rising sun burn through the last wisps of shadow lingering over the palace roofs. A queen had kept her promise. A servant had found her place. And in the quiet heart of history, the world began again. The palace woke before dawn. Not with the usual clang of bells or clatter of servants hurrying for morning duties, but with the subdued rhythm of farewell. Footsteps echoed softly along marble floors. Horses stamped in the courtyard below, their breath clouding in the winter air. The Queen was leaving Hampton Court. Eliza stood at one of the high windows of the nursery, watching the world below through a veil of frost. The royal carriages gleamed faintly in the gray light, lined with gold that looked almost pale against the sky. Inside the nursery, the children were awake early, Prince George still half asleep in Mrs. Elliot's arms, Princess Augusta clutching her coral-teething stick. The quiet murmur of preparation filled the room. Napkins folded, blankets packed, small toys wrapped carefully for the journey. Mrs. Elliot moved with her usual composure, though her eyes betrayed the same sadness Eliza felt. "You'd think after 20 years of these journeys," she said softly, "that I'd have grown used to them." Eliza glanced toward her. "Does it ever feel easier saying goodbye?" Mrs. Elliot smiled faintly. "Never. But we learn to do it with grace." A knock sounded at the door. Mehmet entered, his black cloak glistening with melted snow. He bowed to Mrs. Elliot, then looked at Eliza. "Her Majesty asks that you accompany the nursery carriage," he said. "You are now keeper of the nursery, and your presence is required for the children's comfort." Eliza hesitated. "And you, sir? You will stay." "For a time," Mehmet replied. "There is work yet unfinished here. Letters to send. Shadows to clear." Mrs. Elliot met his eyes, understanding passing silently between them. "We will carry your regards to Windsor," she said quietly. As they prepared to depart, Eliza looked around the nursery one last time. The toys, the cradles, the faint scent of lavender and beeswax, all the little details of daily life that had once defined her world. She felt as though she were leaving part of herself behind within these painted walls. Down in the courtyard, the procession assembled. The Queen emerged from the great hall, veiled in black, the morning wind tugging gently at her cloak. When she paused to look up at the windows, Eliza had the uncanny sense that the Queen's gaze found her, even across the distance. The bells of the chapel began to toll, slow, deliberate, each note marking another page turned in the story of the palace. The carriages began to roll. Eliza sat opposite Mrs. Elliot in the nursery coach, the two royal children nestled safely between them. The wheels clattered softly over the cobblestones, then steadied as they reached the open road. Behind them, Hampton Court receded into the mist, a great red fortress fading to a silhouette, its towers blurred by the breath of morning. For a long while no one spoke. Only the steady rhythm of hooves filled the silence. Finally Mrs. Elliot said, "It's strange. We spend our lives serving within those walls, and yet they never truly belong to us." Eliza looked out the window at the pale landscape sliding by, fields crusted with frost, thin ribbons of river catching the sun. "Maybe that's what makes it sacred," she said quietly. "We tend what others forget. We keep it alive until the next to come." Mrs. Elliot smiled, her lined face softening. "You speak like one who's seen the heart of the palace." "I think I have," Eliza murmured. "And it wasn't gold or marble. It was people." The older woman nodded. "Then you've learned the lesson it took me half a life to see." They rode on in silence, the Queen's carriage gliding ahead through the fog. At one point, Prince George stirred and reached for Eliza's hand. She took it gently, feeling the tiny warmth of his fingers. Princess Augusta was already asleep, her doll resting in her lap, its small bead eyes catching the faint morning light. When they reached the first milestone along the road to Windsor, the Queen's carriage slowed. A window curtain drew back, and Her Majesty looked out toward the nursery coach. For a brief moment, their eyes met again, Queen and servant, ruler and witness, bound by the quiet understanding of those who had seen too much to believe in simple endings. The Queen raised her gloved hand in acknowledgement. Eliza bowed her head. Then the carriage curtain fell and the royal convoy moved on. As the road wound eastward, the great palace behind them disappeared entirely. In its place, the countryside stretched open and quiet, free of marble and ceremony. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth. Mrs. Elliot closed her eyes. "Rest while you can," she said softly. "New walls await us." Eliza leaned back against the carriage seat, watching the horizon. For the first time in months, she felt no fear, no expectation, only calm. The kind of peace that comes not from victory but from endurance. In her mind, the sound of the palace bells lingered, a music that had once marked duty and sorrow, now transformed into a memory of purpose. The Queen was gone. The shadow had lifted. And somewhere behind them, Hampton Court stood silent again, holding its secrets in the hush of empty corridors. Years passed. The frost that had silvered the palace gardens that winter long ago had melted, grown again, and melted 100 times since. The bells that once tolled for kings now rang for their grandchildren, and the corridors of Hampton Court had changed faces more often than the portraits on its walls. And yet, for Eliza Hartwell, some sounds never faded. The soft laughter of children echoing across marble floors. The whispered song sung to hush a royal infant. The rustle of silk as a queen paused to look through the nursery door. They lived on, not in history books or ceremonies, but in her memory, vivid as breath. Eliza never sought more than what she had earned that winter, the quiet authority of one who had seen truth and remained loyal to it. The titled keeper of the nursery stayed with her long after the children had outgrown their cradles. In time, she became governess to Princess Augusta herself, guiding the young girl through lessons of both words and heart. And though she never again set foot in the grand council chambers or the glittering halls of power, she knew her place had been closer to the center of history than any courtier's seat. Now, years later, she returned to Hampton Court. The palace was quieter than she remembered. The Queen had moved her household permanently to Windsor, leaving Hampton as a retreat for memories. The air smelled faintly of age, wax, stone, and something gentler still, like lavender pressed between old pages. Eliza walked slowly through the long gallery. Dust motes danced in the slanting afternoon light. Portraits of monarchs watched from gilded frames, their painted eyes following her with solemn curiosity. She stopped at the door of the old nursery. It creaked open easily as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, time had stood still. The small chairs were gone, the cradles replaced by covered tables, but the windows still caught the same soft light of winter afternoons. She crossed the room and touched the sill, tracing the faint scratches left by a child's wooden toy long ago. For a moment, she could almost hear them again. Prince George's determined steps, the princess's delighted laughter, Mrs. Elliot's firm but tender voice calling for nap time. And in that moment she realized something. All the grand decrees, all the treaties signed, all the gold spent to preserve the kingdom, none of it had mattered more than these quiet rooms. Here, the future of England had learned to speak, to walk, to feel kindness. Here, the invisible hands had shaped the visible world. She smiled faintly. "We were their first history," she whispered. A soft sound made her turn. Mrs. Elliot stood in the doorway. Older now, her hair white, her back slightly stooped, but her eyes were still sharp and full of warmth. "I thought I might find you here," she said. "The nursery remembers its own." Eliza laughed quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd still be at court." "I told the Queen I'd stay until I no longer heard children in the corridors," Mrs. Elliot replied. "And sometimes, even now, I think I still do." The two women sat by the window, watching the pale sun sink beyond the gardens. "Do you ever wonder if they remember us?" Eliza asked softly. Mrs. Elliot smiled. "Not in names, perhaps, but in gestures. In the way they hold their children. In how they look at the world. That's remembrance enough." Silence settled comfortably between them. As the last rays of light fell across the floor, Mrs. Elliot stood. "It's time," she said gently. "The Queen has sent for you. She wishes to see her old keeper." Eliza rose slowly. Her knees ached, her heart full. "Does she still ride at Windsor?" "She does," Mrs. Elliot said, "but not as swiftly as before." They walked together through the echoing halls one last time. When they reached the great doors, Eliza paused and looked back. The winter sun was setting behind the palace, and through the high windows, the golden light spilled across the floorboards, filling the empty corridors with warmth. That light seemed to reach every corner, to the old nursery, the Queen's staircase, even the servants' wing. It touched everything that had once been hidden in shadow. She smiled, knowing what it meant. History would remember kings and queens, but somewhere within its folds, there would always be space for those who had kept the candles burning when the world went dark. For the unseen watchers, the quiet hands, the servants whose loyalty built empires of compassion. As Eliza stepped into the fading day, she whispered one last time to the palace that had raised her, "Rest well, old friend. You've seen enough." And behind her, as the doors closed, Hampton Court seemed to sigh in agreement. The last light lingered on its red brick walls, then faded into evening, leaving only stillness, memory, and the gentle hum of eternity.